Listen, before the first spear was cast, before the first oath was sworn, there were only the walls. They stand not in the sun-baked earth of the Troad, but here, in the deep places of memory, built from the layered stones of story. They are your starting point. See them now, immense, pale, and seamless under a high, hard sky. They enclose everything that is to come, the glory and the ash, the love and the vengeance, the 10-year sigh of a world holding its breath. This is not merely a city. It is an idea, a perfect vessel waiting to be shattered so its story can spill out and flood the centuries. We begin at the end of silence. The tale you are about to hear is a wave that has traveled a vast ocean of time to break at your feet. It carries the salt of divine pettiness and the cold depth of mortal fate. It begins with a whisper, a rustle of divine silk at a wedding feast, the hollow roll of a golden apple across a marble floor. It ends with a different silence, thick with smoke and the echoes of screams, on a shore littered with the wreckage of ships and certainties. Between that whisper and that silence lies an epic of such scale that to tell it true, one must stand at the foot of these legendary ramparts and look up. From this vantage, the coming war feels both inevitable and impossibly small. The passions that will set 1,000 ships aflame are, from here, mere sparks. The heroes who will stride across these plains are, in this moment, only names waiting to be filled with blood and grief. This is the gift and the burden of the beginning, knowing the cataclysm that looms while still seeing the undisturbed dust on the Scamander's banks, the unchallenged flight of hawks over Mount Ida. We have the terrible privilege of foresight. We will watch the fuse be lit, follow its slow, sizzling burn through palaces and bedrooms, across seas and into the very hearts of kings, until it reaches the powder keg. So let these walls anchor you. They are the constant. They will. Witness the pride of Achilles and the nobility of Hector, the cunning of Odysseus and the despair of Priam. They will echo with the din of battle and the quiet tears of Andromache. And in the final hour, they will be betrayed not by force, but by the very hope they were built to protect. This is the journey. From these stones, we will trace the arc of the apple as it leaves the goddess's hand, follow its terrible, beautiful parabola through the lives of men and women, until it falls at last into the silent ashes of a fallen kingdom. The epic awaits. Turn the page and step through the gate. The first stone of the coming avalanche was laid not by a warrior's hand, but in the perfumed halls of celebration. It was a wedding, a union meant to bind a future. The mortal king Peleus, chosen for his piety, wed the sea nymph Thetis, her beauty a shifting, elusive thing like light on deep water. All of Olympus was invited to the feast upon Mount Pelion, a gesture meant to honor the gods and secure their blessing. The air was thick with the scent of ambrosia and roasting meats, the sound of lyres and laughter weaving through the olive groves. It was a picture of divine harmony, a carefully arranged tableau of order and grace. But harmony is a fragile vessel. One goddess had been pointedly excluded, Eris, the spirit of strife. Her presence, it was judged, would sour the sweet wine of concord. This calculated omission was the first crack, the initial flaw in the design. For where discord is denied an invitation, she arrives unannounced. As the festivities reached their peak, a sudden chill passed through the sun-dappled clearing. The laughter did not cease, but it grew strained. The music faltered for a single, discordant beat. She appeared not with a crash of thunder, but as a shadow falling across the feast. Eris stood at the edge of the gathering, a silent, smiling figure clad in robes the color of a bruise. No one greeted her. No one dared. Her eyes, sharp as flint, swept over the assembled splendor of the gods, and her smile deepened. Without a word, she lifted her arm. In her hand was an apple, but no ordinary fruit. It was pure, unblemished gold, a captured sunbeam heavy with malice. With a motion both casual and deliberate, she rolled it across the smooth marble floor. The apple traveled with a soft, metallic whisper, a sound that cut through the music and drew every eye. It came to a perfect, spinning stop at the feet of the three most powerful goddesses present: Hera, the queen of heaven; Athena, the gray-eyed mistress of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, born of sea foam, whose domain was desire itself. Upon the apple's gleaming skin, etched by a divine and mocking hand, was a simple phrase: "For the fairest asterisk." The inscription hung in the air, a three-word spell. The lyres fell silent. The gentle murmur of the feast evaporated, replaced by a thick, potent quiet. All movement ceased as the implications settled over the gathering like a frost. The three goddesses looked from the apple to each other. Hera's majestic composure solidified into regal ice, her authority radiating a cold, unquestionable claim. Athena's keen intellect, usually focused on strategy and craft, now turned inward, assessing her own form with a new, critical sharpness. Aphrodite's languid grace tightened, her smile becoming a weapon as she instinctively tilted her head to catch the light. No one moved to pick it up. The golden apple lay there, a silent, radiant accusation. It was no longer an object, but a question that demanded an answer, a verdict that would require a judge. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis was forgotten, its purpose swallowed by this new, all-consuming rivalry. The bonds of Olympus, stretched thin by petty jealousies before, now hummed with a tangible tension. The seed of the war had been planted not in anger, but in vanity, and it took root instantly in the fertile soil of divine pride. The silence that followed the apple's roll was not one of peace, but of a storm gathering its strength. The three goddesses stood frozen in a triangle of tension, their claims hanging unspoken in the air, each more absolute than the last. To resolve such a divine impasse required an authority beyond even their own. Their eyes, as one, turned toward the high throne of Olympus, where Zeus, the father of gods and men, sat wrapped in the majesty of eternal power. Surely the king of the gods would judge. His word would be final, his wisdom sufficient to name the fairest and restore order. But Zeus, who commands lightning and shakes the earth, looked upon the golden apple and the gleaming, expectant faces of his wife, his daughter, and the goddess whose power even he respected, and he felt a rare and profound reluctance. He saw not a simple question of beauty, but a web of consequences. To choose Hera was to invite her eternal, smug triumph and the lasting, cunning resentment of the others. To choose Athena was to slight queenly power for martial intellect, a different kind of peril. To choose Aphrodite was to unleash the unpredictable, binding force of desire itself upon his ordered cosmos. Each choice was a different kind of fire, and Zeus had no wish to burn his fingers. With a rumble that was more sigh than thunder, he declined the role. His great head shook, his beard like a cloud against the mountain's peak. The judgment, he declared, was beyond even his impartiality. The matter required a mortal eye, unclouded by divine politics, a soul free from the intricate debts and histories of Olympus. He summoned Hermes, the swift messenger, his words brooking no argument. The task was clear. Hermes would escort the three goddesses to a place far from the divine halls, to a mortal of simple life and presumably simple honesty. They would submit themselves to his verdict. And so the strange procession descended from the cloud-wrapped heights of Olympus. Hermes led the way, his caduceus held aloft, his winged sandals skimming just above the earth. Behind him walked the three claimants, their divine radiance dimmed to a merely unbearable splendor for mortal eyes. Hera moved with imperial gravity, every step a statement of sovereignty. Athena followed, her gaze analytical, already assessing the landscape as a field of potential strategy. Aphrodite drifted, a smile playing on her lips as if she already knew a delightful secret, the very air around her softening with promise. Their destination was Mount Ida, a place of rugged, pastoral beauty in the land of Troy. Its slopes were lush with pine and oak, its meadows starred with wildflowers, its air clear and sharp with the scent of thyme and damp earth. A gentle river murmured through a rocky bed. This was a realm of quiet rhythms, of sun and shadow, flock and herd, untouched by the scheming grandeur of palaces or the distant murmur of the sea. Here, they found their judge. He was a young man named Paris, though he did not know that name. Himself, to the world he was Alexander, a shepherd in the service of the royal house. Believed to be a simple peasant, he was in truth a prince of Troy, exposed at birth due to a dire prophecy and raised by herdsmen. His life was one of uncomplicated cycles. The dawn watch, the slow drift of his flocks across the high pastures, the evening gathering at a humble stone fold. He was handsome, with a gentle strength in his bearing, accustomed to the companionship of dogs and the sound of the wind in the trees. His deepest thoughts perhaps of the changing seasons or the health of a ewe. On this day, as the afternoon sun gilded the grassy slopes, he sat upon a rock, carving a piece of wood, his lyre resting beside him. The peace of the mountain was absolute, a perfect, unthinking harmony. He did not look up as the shadow of the gods fell across him, not yet sensing that his simple world was already dissolving, that the golden apple had found its target, and that the long, terrible path to the burning walls had just turned toward his quiet hill. The shepherd looked up from his carving, his knife falling still in his hand. The three figures standing before him in the mountain meadow were unlike any he had imagined in his simple life. Their beauty was not of the earth. It was a pressure in the air, a light that made the sun seem dim. Hermes, the messenger, spoke first, his voice a clear, cool stream explaining the impossible task. The golden apple was placed upon a flat stone. Paris understood. He was to look upon these divine beings and choose. He rose, his heart a frantic bird against his ribs. He approached the first. Hera stepped forward, and the very atmosphere grew solemn and heavy, like the air before a summer storm. She was majesty incarnate, her form radiating an awe-inspiring authority. Her gaze held the weight of centuries and the promise of boundless power. When she spoke, her voice was the sound of empires being built, of laws being etched in stone. She offered him dominion. If he chose her, she would make him lord of all Asia, a king of unimaginable wealth and territory, his name echoing through history as a conqueror. The vision she spun was of thrones, of armies marching at his command, of cities bowing to his will. It was the bribe of absolute temporal power. Then came Athena. She removed her helmet, and her gray eyes were like polished steel, sharp and all-seeing. Hers was a different kind of splendor, one of flawless, formidable intellect. Where Hera promised land, Athena offered mastery. She pledged to fill his mind with strategic wisdom and unshakable courage, to make him the greatest warrior and most cunning leader the world had ever known. With her favor, he would never know defeat in battle. His name would be synonymous with victory and immortal glory earned through his own prowess. Her gift was the triumph of the human spirit, honed to a divine edge. Lastly, Aphrodite approached. She did not need to speak at first. Scent of roses and the sea enveloped Paris, and a warmth spread through his limbs, softening the terror the other goddesses had inspired. Her beauty was not imposing but inviting, a promise of sweetness and delight. She smiled, and the world seemed to narrow to her face. When her words came, they were a gentle, irresistible whisper. She asked for nothing, demanded no awe. She simply offered him love. Not abstract devotion, but the possession of the most beautiful woman born of mortal clay, Helen of Sparta, whose face had launched 1,000 ships in rumor already. She promised not just her, but a life of passion and pleasure, of a desire so profound it would rewrite his destiny. She offered the human heart's most fevered dream. Paris stood in the center of the triangle, the apple gleaming on the stone. The offers hung in the quiet mountain air: empire, glory, love. He was a shepherd, his hands accustomed to the rough wool of sheep, his dreams limited to the horizon of Ida's peaks. The visions of thrones and battlefields were grand, but they were foreign, vast landscapes he could not truly map onto his soul. They spoke to ambition he did not possess. But the vision Aphrodite offered, that was a language he understood in his blood. It was immediate, sensual, real. It was not about ruling the world, but about possessing its most perfect treasure. His eyes, clouded by divine influence and mortal yearning, drifted from the stern, magnificent faces of Hera and Athena to the softly smiling countenance of the goddess of love. The choice in that moment felt inevitable. He stepped forward, his fingers closing around the cool, heavy gold. Without another glance at the spurned queens, he placed the apple into Aphrodite's waiting hand. The goddess's smile deepened into one of pure, triumphant satisfaction. On the mountain, the breeze sighed through the pines. The judgment was made. The shepherd had chosen, and in choosing, he set the fuse to the powder keg of the world. The promise made on the mountain required fulfillment, and so the currents of fate carried Paris across the wine-dark sea. He arrived in Sparta not as a prince of Troy, but as an honored guest of its king, Menelaus. The palace of Sparta stood not for delicate beauty, but for formidable strength, its halls built of stone that echoed with the firm tread of warriors. Yet within its robust heart lay opulence enough to dazzle a shepherd's eye. Sunlight poured through high windows onto floors of polished porphyry. Walls were hung with rich tapestries depicting hunting scenes and ancestral triumphs, their threads woven with Tyrian purple and gold. The air smelled of cedar from the great beams overhead, and of the slow-burning herbs in bronze braziers. King Menelaus was a man of solid, bullish presence, his bearing that of a ruler comfortable in his power and his possessions. He greeted his Trojan guest with robust hospitality, his voice a hearty boom in the vast megaron. He spoke of treaties and trade, of the shared respect between powerful houses, his hand gesturing to the wealth surrounding them, the inlaid tables, the heavy silver cups, the shields mounted as decoration. He was a king secure in his domain, proud of his strong walls and his storied lineage. His pride, however, was most profoundly invested in a living treasure, the pinnacle of his realm's splendor. When Helen entered, the very light in the hall seemed to shift, to gather around her. She was the Word made flesh, the rumor given form. Her beauty was not a single attribute but an atmosphere, a harmony of line and motion that stilled the breath. She moved with a grace that made the rich folds of her peplos seem like a second, more perfect skin. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was bound in an intricate style that hinted at both regal restraint and latent abundance. Her face, famed across all the known world, held a quality of profound, melancholy loveliness, as if she already carried the weight of the songs that would be sung about her. Paris, standing near the hearth, felt the world narrow to a single point. The murmured conversation of the court, the boasting of Menelaus, the gleam of the gold, all of it dissolved into a distant hum. Aphrodite's promise, which had seemed an abstract, glorious dream on Mount Ida, crystallized with terrifying, immediate clarity. This was the prize. This was the desire for which he had risked divine wrath. His breath caught. The cup in his hand became a forgotten weight. He was no longer a guest in a foreign hall, but a man struck by a vision. His mortal soul utterly ensnared by the goddess's design. Helen's gaze, as she performed the duties of hostess, passed over him. For a heartbeat it lingered. It was not a look of recognition, but of a faint, curious disturbance, as if a note from a forgotten song had drifted through the hall. Their eyes met across the smoky space over the heads of unsuspecting nobles. In that glance, a spark leapt the gap. It was charged with the invisible force of Aphrodite's will, a current of doomed recognition that bypassed reason and spoke directly to a deeper, more fatal longing. Paris saw not just a beautiful woman, but the answer to his every unnamed want. Helen, in turn, felt the stable foundations of her life. Her throne, her husband, her role tremble, as if the floor beneath her had subtly shifted. She looked away first, a faint flush coloring her neck, her fingers tightening imperceptibly on the rim of the mixing bowl she held. The king noticed nothing, his talk flowing unabated. But in the space between heartbeats, watched only by the impassive eyes of woven heroes on the walls, the first thread of the future had been pulled. The spark had landed in the tinder of a queen's discontent and a prince's awakened desire, smoldering quietly in the opulent, unwitting court of Sparta. Aphrodite's influence was not a violent compulsion, but a slow, sweet poison in the wine of Helen's will. It began as a restlessness, a sense of confinement within the very opulence that had once defined her station. The sturdy Spartan tapestries seemed to press in. Menelaus's robust laughter sounded distant, a noise from another room. Her thoughts turned, unbidden, to the Trojan guest, to the dark, yearning eyes that had held hers across the hall, eyes that saw not a trophy queen but a woman. The goddess worked in sighs and daydreams, in the heightened scent of night blooming jasmine outside her window, in the way the moonlight fell across her empty bed. Their meetings were not the stuff of bold adventure, but of quiet, tragic inevitability. They occurred in the liminal spaces of the palace, a shadowed colonnade during the siesta hour, the deserted garden by the old olive tree, the storage room fragrant with stored grain and oil. There were no grand declarations, only murmured words that felt like truths long suppressed. Paris spoke of beauty as a force of nature, of love as a destiny that overrode the petty laws of men. Helen listened, and in listening felt the careful architecture of her life, built on duty, oath, and crown, begin to erode from within. Her resistance was not a wall but a veil, and Aphrodite's breath gently blew it aside. The flight itself was an anticlimax, a silent slipping away. It happened on a night when Menelaus was called to Crete for his grandfather's funeral rites. The palace, in its master's absence, slept a trusting sleep. Helen moved through the familiar halls like a ghost, taking little. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice and more like a surrender to a current that had been pulling her out to sea for weeks. She met Paris at the prearranged spot by the small postern gate. No words passed between them. He took her hand, his touch both fevered and final. They fled through the sleeping city, past the unguarded walls, down to the hidden cove where his ship lay with oars muffled, its sail a pale ghost in the starlight. The voyage to Troy was not a passionate elopement, but a numb drift. Helen stood at the stern, watching the dark silhouette of the Laconian coast dissolve into the horizon. She felt no thrill of freedom, only a hollow, expanding cold. She was not a woman stolen, but a woman who had walked, step by step, into a gilded cage of her own making, compelled by a divine hand she could neither see nor fight. The wind that filled the sail was the same wind that would soon bring 1,000 ships of vengeance. She wrapped her shawl tighter, but it could not warm her. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, trading the solid, sunlit world of Sparta for a shadow life, a role in a story whose ending was already written in fire and blood. The spark had ignited, not with a roar but with a sigh, and the smoke would soon darken the skies of two worlds. The news of Helen's flight struck Menelaus not with a cry, but with a cold, tectonic silence. His first feeling was not heartbreak, but a profound violation of order. She was not merely his wife. She was a sworn possession, the keystone of his honor and his kingdom's prestige. The insult demanded not just personal vengeance, but a reckoning that would echo through all of Greece. He remembered the oath. Years before, when suitors from every kingdom had flocked to Sparta for Helen's hand, her adoptive father Tyndareus, fearing a war among them, had devised a cunning pledge. Each prince, before stating his suit, had sworn to defend the chosen husband against any who would steal her away. They had sworn upon the severed pieces of a horse, a grim, archaic ritual binding them to this single future duty. Menelaus, now the wronged king, would call that debt due. Messengers on fast horses rode out from Sparta, their words carrying the weight of shattered peace. They traveled to rocky Mycenae, to sandy Pylos, to rugged Ithaca and Salamis, to the plains of Argos. The call was not a request, but a summons to an old, inconvenient promise. The response was a gathering of reluctant kings, each a world unto himself, drawn together by a thread of sworn word. First came Agamemnon, Menelaus's elder brother, king of Mycenae. He arrived in a chariot of gold and bronze, his presence like a storm cloud settling over the Spartan plain. His ambition was a palpable force, a hunger that saw in his brother's personal slight a grand opportunity for unified power and everlasting fame. For him, the oath was a convenient lever to move armies. His eyes, dark and calculating, surveyed the arriving lords, already tallying ships and men. Next was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who came last and with least enthusiasm. He was a man of intricate mind, whose first and greatest love was his rocky island home and his young wife, Penelope. He had foreseen the decades of blood and toil this oath would unleash, and had tried to feign madness to avoid the original suitor's pledge, a ruse famously uncovered. Now, bound by his own cleverness, he stood apart, his gaze weary and knowing, already tracing the long, tragic arc of the war to come. Nestor of Pylos arrived, his beard white as sea foam, his voice a repository of ancient wisdom and interminable anecdote. He came from duty, a relic of a more honorable age, seeing the oath as a sacred bond not to be broken. His presence lent the gathering a veneer of venerable tradition, even as his advice would often speak of past glories rather than present horrors. Ajax the Greater, a mountain of a man from Salamis, came with a simplicity that bordered on the elemental. For him, the oath was a straightforward matter of honor and strength. He saw the coming conflict not as a political entanglement, but as a chance for glorious combat, his great hands already itching for the weight of his massive shield. Beside him stood Diomedes of Argos, young, fierce, and impatient, a lord in the mold of the old heroes, eager to prove his valor and win renown. They assembled in the Spartan Megaron, the very hall, now haunted by Helen's absence. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions and divergent desires. Menelaus stood before them, not as a grieving husband, but as a king invoking a contract. He spoke of the stolen queen, the violated guest right, the mockery made of their collective oath. His words were not a plea, but a reminder of the binding power of the severed horse, the curse that would fall upon oath breakers. The kings listened, each wrestling with private reluctance beneath the mantle of public duty. They were bound, not by friendship or common cause, but by the ghost of a ritual, by the fear of divine retribution and the loss of face. With grim acceptance, one by one, they nodded. The oath, sworn in a time of peace and hope, now mobilized for a war of fire and ash. The gathering was no triumphant alliance, but a funeral for peace, each man a pallbearer carrying his own fate to the waiting ships. The great muster was at Achilles, a narrow strait where the wind seemed to hold its breath. What had been a quiet shore of pebbles and scrub became a roaring, stinking, sprawling wound in the earth. The scale of the endeavor was not seen all at once, but felt in 1,000 cumulative assaults on the senses. First came the sound. A league away, one heard the relentless, percussive thunder of axes biting into ancient pine and oak. It was a sound of violence against the land, a sharp, cracking lament that echoed off the hills from dawn until dusk, as every kingdom felled its forests to meet its quota of hulls. Then the smell. As the raw timbers were shaped and joined, the air grew thick and acrid with the scent of boiling pitch. Great cauldrons smoked day and night, men sweating as they daubed the black, viscous tar into seams, making the newborn vessels watertight. The odor mixed with the salt of the sea, the sweat of laborers, and the distant, greasy smoke of countless cook fires. It was the smell of industry, but also of sacrifice. The very essence of the land was being melted and poured into the shape of war. And then the sight. Day by day, the beach transformed. The long, gentle curve of the shore vanished beneath a bristling, chaotic forest of prows and masts. The ships were not uniform. They were a testament to the disparate kingdoms that built them. High, curved stems painted with glaring eyes rose beside simpler functional designs. Shields were lashed along the gunwales, a mosaic of different blazons, lions, boars, spirals, stars, catching the flat light. Their numbers multiplied until they seemed beyond counting. 1,000 beached wooden beasts, their hulls groaning as they settled on the shingle, waiting for the wind that would not come. The men who milled among them were a nation unto themselves. Warriors honed spear points, the rhythmic scrape of stone on bronze a constant whisper beneath the greater din. Armorers hammered at breastplates over portable forges, the clang a sharp counterpoint to the axes. Boys ran with water skins, heralds shouted orders that were lost in the cacophony. There was a surface energy, a buzz of purpose, but beneath it, a strange unease took root. The very scale of the fleet, this monstrous proof of shared will, began to feel like an omen. The idle army, growing restless with the windless delay, cast long shadows in the setting sun. The mood turned, soured by waiting. The foreboding did not arrive as a storm, but as a chill settling into the bones of the endeavor. They had built a magnificent instrument of vengeance, but as they looked out at the motionless sea and the crowded, silent ships, a quiet dread whispered that they were not its masters, but merely its first, doomed passengers. The stillness at Olympus was not peaceful. It was a suffocation. Day after day, the sea lay like polished lead, unruffled by even a whisper of wind. The sails of the 1,000 ships hung limp, useless as shrouds. The immense fleet, that proud testament to mortal will, was rendered a prisoner. Of the calm, an ugly restlessness fermented among the host. Supplies dwindled, quarrels flared like sparks in dry tinder. The great enterprise, so grand in conception, was dying of inertia before it could begin. In his tent, Agamemnon, high king of the Greeks, felt the weight of the stalled heavens pressing down upon his shoulders. The unity of the kings, fragile at best, threatened to shatter against the rock of this unnatural calm. He summoned the seer Calchas, a man whose eyes seemed to look upon a world layered with invisible, bloody writing. The prophet studied the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed bulls, the subtle tremors in the air. His face grew pale, his voice dropping to a hollow register as he pronounced the divine verdict. The goddess Artemis was offended. Her wrath stilled the winds. Her price for releasing them was specific and terrible: the life of Agamemnon's own daughter, the young and radiant Iphigenia. She must be offered upon the altar. A profound silence swallowed the tent. The demand was not a test of faith, but a trap of fate sprung by a deity's cold whim. Agamemnon's agony was a private earthquake. His kingly facade crumbled into the dust of a father's horror. The ambition that had driven him to champion this war warred with the primal instinct to protect his child. He paced the confines of his tent, a caged animal, the faces of his brother Menelaus and the expectant army looming like specters outside the linen walls. The oath, the fleet, the gathered glory of Greece, all balanced on this single, monstrous decision. To refuse was to dissolve the alliance and become an object of scorn and ridicule. To comply was to murder a part of his own soul. In the end, the king, the commander of men, strangled the father. He chose the path of blood, rationalizing it as a tragic necessity for the greater good, a sacrifice for the countless men who waited on the shore. A lie was crafted, a beautiful, poisonous fiction. Messengers were sent to Mycenae bearing joyous news. Iphigenia was summoned to Aulis. They told Queen Clytemnestra to be wed to the great hero Achilles before the fleet sailed. It was a union of glory, a fitting prelude to victory. The deception was flawless in its cruelty, playing upon a mother's hopes and a young girl's dreams. Clytemnestra, pleased by the brilliant match, prepared her daughter with tender care. Iphigenia arrived at the camp dressed in bridal finery, her heart fluttering with innocent anticipation, seeing the gathered host as witnesses to her happiness, not her doom. The revelation was a slow, chilling horror. There was no wedding canopy, only a stark altar of rough stone. The festive garlands were absent. The faces of the soldiers were turned away, ashamed. Achilles, discovering his name had been used as bait, raged but was powerless against the tide of grim necessity. Iphigenia's confusion melted into a dawning, paralyzing terror. She looked to her father but found a stranger. Wearing Agamemnon's face, his eyes glassy with a grief he dared not express. Her pleas were not recorded by the poets, but her silence in that final moment was louder than any scream. She was led to the stone, a perfect victim in her false bridal gown. The priest raised the knife. The sun glinted on the blade. The act was performed with a solemn, awful gravity, a ritual murder to purchase a favorable wind. As her lifeblood soaked the earth, a sigh stirred the leaves in the distant trees. Then a gust, fresh and cold, swept in from the sea, filling the idle sails with a sound like 1,000 gasps. The winds were released. The fleet could sail. But a shadow now clung to the ships, a curse woven into their very timbers, and in the heart of the king who had given the order, a wound festered that would never heal, waiting for his own homecoming to turn septic. The war did not begin with a cataclysm, but with a settling in. The initial clash of armies on the Scamander plain was a brief, furious spasm, after which both sides retreated behind their lines, the Greeks to their makeshift camp by the ships, the Trojans to their towering walls. What followed was not the epic confrontation of legend, but a long, grinding attrition of spirit. 9 years passed not as a heroic chronicle, but as a slow, gray tide of weariness washing over the shores of both camps. The seasons cycled with a mocking regularity. Spring brought not hope, but the same mud, the same reluctant green pushing through the trampled earth where men had died the previous autumn. Summer's heat baked the bloodstains into the dust and filled the air with the thick, sweet stench of decay from unburied corpses after skirmishes. Autumn winds carried the smoke of countless small fires, and the sound of coughing from damp tents. Winter was a time of shivering stagnation, of short, dull days where the opposing sentries, huddled in their cloaks, resembled each other more than their own kings. The great heroes became familiar figures in a tedious drama. Mornings might see a champion, a Diomedes, an Ajax, a Hector, stride onto the no-man's land between the lines, issue a challenge, and engage in a fierce personal combat that thrilled the watching armies. But these duels resolved nothing. They were punctuation in a sentence that never ended. The men watched with a professional interest, placing bets, cheering half-heartedly, but the fire of the first year had banked to embers. Afterward, the armies would sometimes clash in a general melee, a pushing, sweating, screaming scrum that gained or lost a few hundred yards of worthless ground before both sides disengaged, exhausted, leaving the field littered with the wounded and the dead for the carrion birds. A strange, grim familiarity grew between the enemies. During occasional truces to collect the dead, Greeks and Trojans would work side by side, not speaking, but recognizing faces from across the field. They exchanged terse nods, shared a water skin, under a flag of temporary peace, and saw in each other's eyes the same longing for home, the same deep fatigue. They knew each other's battle cries, the patterns of each other's attacks. The war became a profession, a terrible, habitual trade. Boredom was a more insidious enemy than any warrior. In the Greek camp, men mended armor for the 10th time, played endless games of dice, and stared at the unchanging silhouette of Troy's walls until they hated the very sight of them. They told the same stories of home until the stories felt like myths. Hope for a quick resolution had long since faded, replaced by a dull certainty that this was simply life now, an eternal, grinding present tense. The initial glorious cause, the retrieval of Helen, became a distant, almost absurd abstraction. She was a phantom in a tower, the face that had launched them into this endless, muddy purgatory. The passion of the first year curdled into routine, the great adventure into a siege that was less a military operation than a shared, protracted misery. The walls of Troy stood, and the Greek ships rotted on the shore, and the world seemed to have forgotten how to move forward, trapped in the amber of 9 weary years. The spark that ignited the final, fatal phase of the war was not struck on the battlefield, but in the loot tents behind the lines. It began with a plague, a silent, creeping horror sent by Apollo in answer to his priest's prayers. For days, black smoke from endless funeral pyres stained the sky above the Greek camp, and the stench of sickness hung thicker than the smell of the sea. The prophet Calchas, emboldened by Achilles, finally named the cause. Agamemnon had insulted Apollo by refusing to ransom the priest's daughter, a captive named Chrysis. The king, cornered by the collective despair of his army, had no choice but to return the girl. But the loss of his prize, the public blow to his prestige, festered in his proud heart. He would not suffer alone. The assembly of Greeks was a tense, silent gathering. Agamemnon rose, his face a mask of controlled fury. His voice, when it came, was cold and sharp as a drawn blade. He would return his prize, he declared, but he would have another in her place, and he would take it from the greatest of the Greeks to remind them all of his absolute authority. His gaze, heavy with intent, swept across the faces of the kings and settled upon Achilles. The demand hung in the air, a deliberate provocation. He would take Briseis, the maiden awarded to Achilles as a prize of honor for his unmatched valor. A stillness more profound than any battle lull fell over the assembly. Every man understood the line being crossed. Briseis was not merely a captive. She was a symbol, the tangible proof of Achilles' worth, the honor he had earned with his spear. To take her was to strip him bare before the entire host, to declare his glory worthless before the king's whim. Achilles' reaction was not a shout, but a slow, seismic. Rising, the air around him seemed to crackle with contained force. His pride, that vast and fragile architecture upon which his entire identity was built, shuddered under the insult. He saw not just a loss, but a fundamental unraveling of the order of things. If the greatest warrior could be so dishonored, then the war itself was a hollow fraud, a game where kings moved men like pieces and discarded honor when it suited them. His words, when they came, were low, each one carved from ice and fire. He would not lift a spear, he vowed, not a single finger in Agamemnon's service. Let the Trojans drive the Greeks back to their very ships. Let them burn the hulls and slaughter the men. Only then, when Agamemnon lay in the dust, begging for the help he had spurned, would he understand the value of the man he had insulted. It was not a temporary peak, but a solemn, cosmic withdrawal. He would quit the field. His Myrmidons would quit the field. The greatest force in the Greek army would become a silent, watching audience to its own potential destruction. With that, he turned, his cloak swirling, and strode from the assembly, leaving a vacuum of dread in his wake. The quarrel was no mere dispute. It was the cracking of the world's axis. Achilles retreated to his tents by the gray sea, his wrath a cold, dark star now fixed in the heavens, its gravitational pull destined to drag countless lives into its crushing orbit. The true war, the one foretold by prophets and feared by wise men, had finally begun. Achilles stood at the shoreline, the gray waves hissing over his feet, his gaze fixed on the distant, hateful line of Troy. The insult burned within him, a cold fire that had extinguished all other warmth. The bustling Greek camp at his back was now a foreign country. The sounds of preparation, the shouts of men, were the noises of a world from which he had exiled himself. He turned from the sea and walked not to his tent, but to a secluded stretch of beach where the breakers drowned all other sound. There alone he called out to the deep. His voice was not a shout, but a raw, carrying plea, the sound of a crack running through marble. He called for his mother. The sea, which had been choppy and indifferent, grew still. Then it parted, a smooth, green pathway opening in the foam, and from the depths rose Thetis. She emerged not in a surge of power, but in a shimmer of grief, her immortal face already etched with the sorrow of foresight. She took her son's head in her hands, her touch cool as deep water, and listened as he poured out his agony, the theft of his honor, the public shame, the hollowing of his glory. His words were not of Briseis the woman, but of Briseis the symbol, the tangible proof of his worth now stripped away. He asked not for vengeance against Agamemnon, but for justice. He begged her to go to Olympus, to kneel before the throne of Zeus, and remind the father of gods of the services he, Achilles, had rendered. Let Zeus grant the Trojans victory, he pleaded. Let him tip the scales of battle until the Greeks, broken and desperate, are driven back to their very ships. Only when Agamemnon and all his host tasted the bitter dust of defeat would they comprehend the true value of the warrior they had spurned. Thetis, her heart breaking for the mortal son she could not save from his short, glorious fate, kissed his forehead. She slipped back beneath the waves, a streak of silver in the green, and began her ascent to the high halls of the gods. Olympus was a realm of eternal light and quiet music, a stark contrast to the muddy, blood-stained world below. She found Zeus sitting apart on his towering throne, the aegis across his knees, his brow clouded with the weight of countless destinies. She approached not as a powerful nymph, but as a supplicant, and with a grace that spoke of ancient sorrow, she wrapped herself around his knees, one hand touching his chin in the timeless gesture of supplication. She reminded him of her son, of his destiny to die young and glorious, and of the cruel dishonor that now made a mockery of that fate. Her request was simple, terrible, and absolute. Grant victory to the Trojans. Humble the Greeks. Make them ache for Achilles' arms. Zeus, the cloud-gatherer, was silent for a long time. The request was a boulder thrown into the pond of fate. The ripples would spread far. To aid the Trojans was to oppose his wife Hera and his daughter Athena, both fierce partisans of the Greeks. It meant intervening directly in the mortal struggle, bending the natural course of the war. But he owed Thetis a debt, for she had once saved him from rebellion. With a slow, deep sigh that stirred the clouds on the mountain's peak, he nodded. He could not speak aloud, for Hera's sharp ears were ever listening, but his promise was given in that solemn, silent gesture. He would do as she asked. The balance of the war, held in a weary stalemate for 9 long years, would now be deliberately, divinely tipped. Thetis, her mission complete, descended back to the sea, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had secured not her son's happiness, but the death of countless others as the necessary prelude to his restored honor. On the plains below, the Greeks, unaware of the celestial bargain, readied for another day's skirmish. But the air itself had changed. A new current, cold and purposeful, now flowed through the world. The wrath of Achilles had been inscribed in the ledger of heaven, and the machinery of tragedy, oiled by divine will, began to turn with a slow, irrevocable grind. With the divine scales tipped, the war's weary equilibrium shattered. Achilles' absence was a yawning chasm in the Greek line, a void where their greatest force of nature had been. Into this void surged the Trojans, led by Hector, who moved now with the grim certainty of a man feeling the favor of destiny. The Greek defenses, which had held for so long, began to buckle not with a crash, but with a slow, relentless groan. The plain before Troy became a slaughterhouse under a bronze sky. The first to stem the tide briefly was Diomedes of Argos. In a frenzy of God-empowered strength, Athena herself breathing fury into his limbs, he became a whirlwind of destruction. His Aristeia, his moment of supreme glory, was a blur of terrible motion. He cut through the Trojan ranks like a scythe through ripe grain, his chariot wheels churning gore. He even wounded Aphrodite as she tried to spirit her son Aeneas away, and drove his spear against the war god Ares himself, forcing the deity from the field with a bellow of pain. For a day he was unstoppable, a one-man dam against the flood. But even his divine vigor had limits. A well-aimed arrow from Paris's bow found the gap in his armor, piercing his foot and sending him limping from the fray. His moment of glory ended. The dam cracked. Other heroes fell like trees in a storm. Agamemnon took a spear thrust to his arm, the king's, blood mingling with common filth on the ground. Odysseus, ever the cunning fighter, was wounded in the side, his cleverness no shield against the press of numbers. The great Ajax, that bulwark of men, was driven back step by heavy step, his immense shield ringing with countless blows until his arms trembled with fatigue. The Greek line contracted, compressed, like a beast curling around a wound. The din was incessant, the shriek of tearing metal, the screams of horses, the unified, roaring chants of the Trojans sensing victory. Hector, aflame at the head of the advance, pressed the advantage with relentless will. The fighting raged past the ditch, over the low wall the Greeks had built, through the very gates of their fortified camp. The Greeks were driven back, always back, toward the one thing that tethered them to home, their beached ships. The Trojans, their eyes wild with a hope they had not dared for 9 years, brought fire. Men with blazing torches darted forward, hurling brands of pitch-soaked pine at the proud, curved hulls. The first ship, its dry timbers ancient and ready, caught with a hungry asterisk whoosh asterisk. Orange flames licked up the stern, painting the faces of the defenders in hellish light. The smoke was thick and black, a signal of impending doom rising into the twilight. Desperation, cold and final, settled over the Greek host. They fought now with their backs to the sea, not for glory or for Helen, but for simple survival, each man knowing the fire that consumed the ships would soon consume them all. The tide had turned, and it was a tide of blood and flame, washing them toward annihilation. The desperation in the Greek camp was a tangible fog, thick with the acrid smell of a ship still smoldering and the low moans of the wounded. In his tent, Agamemnon, his arm bandaged, finally faced the abyss his pride had helped to dig. The council of the elders was unanimous. Achilles must be appeased. The king, swallowing his arrogance like a bitter draught, assembled a lavish ransom. He offered 7 tripods untouched by fire, 10 talents of gold, 20 shining cauldrons, a dozen strong horses, 7 skilled women from Lesbos, the return of Briseis with a solemn oath she remained untouched, and upon their return to Greece, one of his own daughters in marriage, with cities as her dowry. It was a king's fortune, a staggering admission of fault. To bear these offers, he chose 3 men: Odysseus, the silver-tongued; Ajax the greater, the blunt and honorable; and Phoenix, Achilles' old tutor, a father figure whose presence was a plea to memory itself. The walk to the Myrmidon encampment was short in distance, but vast in implication. They found Achilles apart from his men, sitting on a carved chair in the forecourt of his tent, his eyes not on his visitors but on the sea, plucking a melancholy tune on a finely wrought lyre. The sight was jarring. The greatest warrior of the age engaged in an act of quiet contemplation while his comrades faced annihilation. He acknowledged them with a slight nod, his expression unreadable. Odysseus, as agreed, spoke first. With all his famed persuasion, he laid out Agamemnon's extravagant offers, painting a picture of restored honor, future wealth, and immortal glory if he would only relent and return to the fight. He spoke of the Greek plight, of the fire at the ships, of the shared shame if they were driven into the sea. Achilles listened, his fingers stilled on the lyre's strings. When Odysseus finished, the silence stretched, filled only by the distant crash of waves. Then Achilles spoke, and his voice was the most terrifying thing they had heard, not a roar of anger, but a calm, chilling clarity. He thanked them for coming. He acknowledged the generosity of the gifts. And then he dismantled the very premise of their offer. What use were tripods and gold to a dead man? What value had a dowry of cities when he would never see them? Agamemnon's gifts, he said, were as dust. His life, his such, was worth more than all the treasures of Troy. He laid bare his choice, a long, obscure life sailing home, or a short, glorious one ending on the plains of Troy. Agamemnon had already stolen the glory, rendering the short life meaningless. Therefore, he would choose the long one. He would sail for home at dawn. Phoenix then spoke, his old voice trembling with emotion, reminding Achilles of the bond between them, of the lessons of honor and the fury that consumes a man who nurses his wrath too long. Ajax followed, his words blunt and wounded, speaking of the bonds of comradeship, of the sheer, unthinkable shame of abandoning friends in their extremity. Achilles' resolve, forged in the cold fire of his philosophy, did not break, but it wavered at the edges. He acknowledged their love, their arguments. He would not fight for Agamemnon, he repeated, but he made one small concession. He would not sail tomorrow. He would stay, and he would allow his myrmidons to fight if the battle reached his own ships and tents. It was a sliver, but it was not the return they needed. The embassy, laden with promises, departed empty-handed. They walked back through the gathering dusk, their steps heavy. Behind them, Achilles remained, a solitary figure against the vast, darkening sea, his choice made, the fate of thousands now sealed by his cold, unwavering calculus. The last hope had guttered and died. The Greek camp slept a fitful, exhausted sleep, but in the tent of Odysseus no lamp was extinguished. The failure of the embassy had left only one path: desperate action. Intelligence, gleaned from a captured Trojan scout, spoke of a fresh threat. Rhesus, a Thracian king and Trojan ally, had arrived with a contingent of men and, more crucially, a team of magnificent, snow-white horses. An oracle stated that if these horses drank from the river Scamander and ate the grass of the Trojan plain, the city would become unconquerable. They could not be allowed to see the dawn. Odysseus and Diomedes, the latter's foot wound tightly bound, volunteered for the grim, silent work. They blackened their armor with soot and ash, strapped on short, deadly swords, and slipped into the enveloping cloak of the moonless night. The world beyond the ditch was a landscape of shadows and echoes. They moved like ghosts through the trampled no-man's land, their senses strained to breaking. Every rustle in the dry grass was a sentry, every sigh of the wind a challenge. The only light came from the distant, scattered watchfires of the Trojan camp, pinpricks of orange in the profound black. The air was cold, carrying the distant smell of dung fires and the faint, metallic scent of the river. Their progress was agonizingly slow, a test of nerve more than speed, each foot placed with infinite care to silence the crunch of pebbles. They found the Thracian contingent on the far right of the Trojan lines, separate and poorly guarded, confident in the depth of their position. The men slept deeply, weary from their long march, their breaths a low chorus of exhaustion. Among them King Rhesus lay wrapped in a rich cloak, his famous horses tethered nearby, their white coats glowing faintly in the starlight. The animals stood still, their heads drooping in sleep. Odysseus and Diomedes shared a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. There was no ceremony, no challenge. This was not heroism, but butchery. Diomedes moved with a predator's efficiency, his blade finding its mark again and again in the dark. Rhesus died without a sound, a brief gurgle lost in the night. The other Thracians followed, cut down in their slumber, the only sound the wet, soft thuds of the work. With the deed done, the tension coiled tighter. Now came the greater risk. Odysseus untied the magnificent horses, his hands steady on their leads. The beasts, sensing strangers, snorted and shifted, their hooves scraping on the stony ground. A sentry nearby stirred, mumbling. In his sleep, both Greeks froze, becoming statues in the gloom. The moment stretched, brittle as ice. The sentry settled. With painstaking slowness, they led the horses away, back through the labyrinth of sleeping enemies, past the dark shapes of tents and stacked spears. Every step was an eternity, every creak of leather a potential death knell. Only when they crossed the ditch and saw the darker bulk of the Greek ramparts before them did they allow themselves to breathe. They entered the camp not as triumphant raiders, but as specters returning from a haunted world, leading their pale, stolen prizes through the silent rows of ships. The night held their secret, and the coming dawn would bring the Trojans a mystery and an omen of despair, while the Greeks gained only a temporary, blood-soaked advantage in their long, weary dance with fate. The final push came at noon, under a sun bleached of all pity. The Trojan tide, swelled by fresh allies and divine favor, broke against the Greek. Ramparts not in a single wave, but in a relentless, grinding surge. Hector, a figure of bronze and flame, fought at the very apex of the assault. His great voice rose above the din, a rallying cry that turned men into instruments of his will. The ditch, once a formidable barrier, was filled with corpses and debris until it became a foul causeway. The wooden palisade groaned under the weight of bodies and the bite of axes. Then, with a splintering crack that seemed to tear the sky, a section gave way. The breach was not wide, but it was a fatal wound. Through the gap, like pus from a lanced boil, poured the Trojan host, their eyes wild with a victory long dreamed of and now within grasp. The battle compressed into a frenzied chaos around the beached ships. No longer a war of maneuver, it became a savage brawl for survival on the very threshold of the Greek world. Men fought back to back on the gangways, slipped in the blood pooling on the sand, and grappled like beasts in the shallows. The air thickened with the screams of horses, the clash of bronze, and the terrible, wet sounds of butchery. Fire arrows hissed through the smoke, thudding into timber. One ship, then another, burst into flame, the crackling roar a new, horrifying element in the symphony of destruction. The Greeks fought with the desperate strength of men who knew the sea at their backs offered only drowning. But the line was buckling, fraying at every edge. The luminous horror of total defeat, of watching their only means of escape burn, settled over them like a shroud. From the high deck of his own untouched ship, Patroclus watched the disaster unfold. He had been tending the wounded, but now he stood frozen, his healer's hands clenched into fists. He saw the flames reflected in the wide, terrified eyes of the men streaming past. He saw the triumphant figure of Hector, a dark star in the maelstrom, driving the attack ever deeper. A profound, helpless anguish seized him. He turned and ran, not away from the battle, but toward the one man who could stop it. He found Achilles still sitting before his tent, his face a mask of impassive observation, as if the carnage were a play performed for his benefit. Patroclus fell before him, his words tumbling out in a torrent of despair. He begged not for himself, but for the Myrmidons, for the Greeks, for the very idea of their cause now turning to ash. He could stand by no longer. Let him, Patroclus, don the famous armor. Let him lead the Myrmidons into the fray. The sight of Achilles' semblance might check the Trojan advance, might save the ships. Achilles looked at his dearest companion, and the cold wrath in his eyes thawed for a moment into something more complex: love, fear, and a terrible premonition. He consented, but his terms were ironclad, born of a desperate hope to control a fate he felt slipping from his grasp. Patroclus could wear the armor. He could drive the Trojans back from the ships, but he must go no further. He must not, under any passion of battle, pursue the fleeing enemy toward the walls of Troy. His only mission was defense, a brilliant, limited counterstroke to avert disaster, not to seek glory. Once the ships were safe, he was to return. Achilles' voice held a plea beneath the command. Patroclus, his heart soaring with desperate purpose, agreed. The armor was brought forth, its divine bronze gleaming even in the smoky air. As Patroclus began to strap the greaves to his shins, Achilles turned his face toward the burning ships, his own war now a private, silent agony of watching and waiting, his wrath momentarily shackled by a deeper, more terrifying dread. The bronze was cold at first, then warmed quickly with the heat of his body, molding to him with an unsettling, intimate weight. As Patroclus fastened the final strap of the glorious corselet, he felt the ghost of Achilles' presence envelop him. The breadth of the shoulders, the taper at the waist, the sheer, terrifying aura of invincibility hammered into the metal by Hephaestus' own hand. The great shield, with its concentric worlds of peace and war, felt like carrying a cosmos on his arm. The high-crested helmet, when he lowered it over his brow, narrowed his vision to a slit of light and muffled the world's sounds, leaving only the drumbeat of his own heart. He was no longer Patroclus, the companion, the healer. He was a symbol, a vessel for another man's legend, and the power of it was a heady, terrifying wine. He stepped from the tent, and a gasp rippled through the waiting Myrmidons, a sound like wind through reeds. For an instant, even they were deceived. The sun struck the polished greaves and the silver-studded sword belt with a blinding flash. He stood before them, a figure of radiant, menacing gold and bronze, and in their hopeful, desperate eyes Achilles had returned. A roar went up, not of recognition, but of relief so profound it bordered on pain. The spirit that had drained from the Greek ranks over the long days of retreat now flooded back, galvanized by this apparition. Patroclus raised Achilles' heavy ash spear, and the Myrmidons, their own morale resurrected, clashed their weapons against their shields in a thunderous, rhythmic chant. The air itself seemed to vibrate with renewed purpose. They moved toward the fray not as reinforcements, but as a tidal wave of pent-up fury. The sight of that familiar, godlike figure at their head struck the advancing Trojans like a physical blow. Their triumphant surge faltered, confused murmurs passing through their ranks. The man burning the ships looked up, saw the glint of the unmistakable armor, and his face paled beneath its grime. Hector himself, pressing the attack at the center, paused, his brow furrowed in doubt. Was it possible? Had the wrathful god of the Myrmidons finally been appeased? The uncertainty was a weapon more potent than any spear. In that moment of hesitation, the Greek line, which had been bending to the breaking point, stiffened. Patroclus, driving into the thickest press of the battle, found a strength that was not his own. It was the armor's promise, the men's belief, the desperate energy of the counterattack flowing through him. He fought with a ferocity he had never known, the spear in his hand moving with a deadly, unfamiliar grace. Where he advanced, the Trojans recoiled, their confidence shattered by the mere semblance of their greatest fear. The Myrmidons, unleashed and roaring, followed their Achilles with a vengeful joy, cutting a bloody swath through the enemy ranks. The fire-bearers were cut down before they could throw their brands. The press at the breached wall reversed, the Trojans now scrambling back over the very debris they had crossed in triumph. The ships, save for those already lost, were saved. The relentless, crushing momentum of the Trojan assault was not just halted, it was thrown back in disarray. On the plain, a space cleared around the gleaming, godlike figure, a circle of awe and terror. Patroclus, breathing hard inside the helmet, felt the intoxicating rush of it, the hope, the desperation, the sheer, world-altering power of the lie he embodied. The tide had turned again on the strength of a reflection. For a glorious, fleeting hour, the ghost of Achilles was enough to sweep the field. The success was a poison in his blood. Seeing the Trojans flee, their ranks broken and streaming back across the plain toward their distant walls, Patroclus felt the cautionary words of Achilles dissolve like mist in the heat of triumph. The armor's power, the men's adulation, the intoxicating sight of a routed enemy, it all fused into a single, compelling imperative: pursue. He had saved the ships. Now he could win the war. The thought was a bright, burning arrow in his mind, obscuring the boundary between defense and conquest. He shouted to his charioteer, his voice muffled and strange inside the helmet, and pointed his spear toward the Scamander. The Myrmidons, swept up in the frenzy, followed without question. The counterattack became a headlong chase. He drove them across the blood-soaked ford, past the scattered corpses of the morning's fight, across the open ground that had been a no-man's land for 9 years. The walls of Troy grew larger, their pale, imposing bulk a taunt and a temptation. 3 times he charged the Scaean gate, and 3 times he was beaten back, but each assault carried him closer to that immovable stone. He was no longer a man in armor, but a force, a divine instrument hurtling toward a predetermined shattering. It was then that Apollo intervened. The god, a patron of Troy, moved unseen through the chaos. He came behind Patroclus, not with a weapon, but with a hand. A single, terrible slap between the shoulder blades, a blow that held the weight of a mountain. The world exploded into ringing silence. The helmet was torn from his head, clattering away across the stones. The gleaming breastplate seemed to loosen, its divine fit suddenly clumsy. Patroclus staggered, the strength draining from his limbs, his vision swimming. The god's touch had not wounded his flesh, but had shattered the aura of invincibility, stripping him bare before the eyes of men. He stood, dazed and vulnerable, the mortal revealed within the divine shell. The Trojan warrior Euphorbus saw his chance. He darted in, his spear point finding the gap at the collarbone where the armor now sat awry. The bronze bit deep. Patroclus cried out, a sound of shock more than pain, and stumbled back from the gate, the spear shaft protruding from his body. He was wounded but not yet fallen. He tried to retreat, to shuffle back toward his own lines, but the world had slowed to a thick nightmare syrup. And then Hector was there. The Trojan prince, having seen the helmet fall and the god's invisible stroke, understood the truth. This was not Achilles. This was the friend, the impostor, now bleeding and exposed. There was no glory in the kill, only a grim, practical necessity. He drove his own spear home, a final, merciful thrust that pierced the heart. Patroclus fell, the earth receiving him with a soft, final thud. The great armor clanged against the ground, a dissonant chord. The silence that followed was immediate and local, a pocket of awful quiet in the storm of battle. Hector stood over the body, breathing heavily. Then he set to work. With efficient, brutal motions, he began to strip the glorious armor from the corpse. The greaves, the corselet, the shield, each piece removed was a layer of Achilles' mythic power being peeled away and claimed. It was not mere plunder. It was a profound, symbolic transfer. Hector, buckling the famed breastplate over his own chest, felt the weight of a destiny now irrevocably tangled with his enemy, S. He left the body, a pale, broken thing in the dust, and donned the helmet. Transformed, he stood as a dark mirror of the Greek hero, a usurper of glory. The death was complete. The armor was taken. And on the distant shore, Achilles, feeling a sudden, inexplicable cold in his soul, turned his eyes from the sea toward the plain, a nameless dread coiling in his heart like a serpent. The dread that had coiled in Achilles' heart tightened into a fist of ice when he saw the ragged figure stumbling from the battlefield, away from the retreating Myrmidons. It was Antilochus, Nestor's son, his face a mask of ash and horror. He did not need to speak. The truth was in his stricken eyes, in the way he fell to his knees in the dust before the tent, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. The news traveled the last distance on the air itself, a void where the world's sound had been. Patroclus was dead. Achilles did not cry out, not at first. The world simply inverted. The sand beneath his feet, the sky above, the very light, all of it drained of meaning, leaving only a vast, hollow shell. He reached out a hand as if to steady himself against a reality that had ceased to exist, and his fingers found only empty air. Then the sound began. It started low in his chest, a subterranean tremor, and erupted upward. It was a cry that held no human quality. It was the sound of a mountain cracking, of a great tree splintering from the roots. It was raw, wordless agony given voice, a wave of pure sonic grief that rolled across the camp, silencing the clatter of arms, the murmurs of men, the very sigh of the wind. Warriors froze, their blood running cold at the primal horror of it. The sound did not stop at the shore. It traveled over the wine-dark sea, a vibration in the deep, until it reached the sunless halls of Thetis. She heard it in the water around her, a distortion that was her son's soul tearing. She knew. Rising from the depths with her sister Nereids in a frothing wake of shared sorrow, she sped to the Trojan shore. She found him prone in the black dirt, his great hands clawing trenches in the earth, his body racked with tremors that were not sobs but seismic shocks. He was pouring dust over his golden head, defiling his glory, his face streaked with grime and a grief so profound it had become a physical landscape. When he looked up at her, his eyes were those of a lost child in a hero's face. His words, when they came, were fragments of a shattered world. He spoke of his own death, now welcome, of his worthless wrath, of the hollow shell of glory that remained. His rage, that towering, cosmic fire, had turned inward, a black flame consuming him from the inside. Yet even in that abyss, a new direction for that rage was cohering. The target was no longer Agamemnon. That insult was a pebble next to the mountain of his loss. He needed his myrmidons. He needed arms. He needed to walk into the river of Trojans and become death itself. But first, he had to bridge the chasm he himself had carved. Rising, a figure of dust and devastation, he walked toward the Agamemnon's quarters. The Greeks parted before him, not in fear, but in a kind of awe at the walking wound in their midst. He found the king outside his tent. No herald announced him. Achilles simply stood, his grief a more formidable presence than any armor. He spoke, his voice scraped raw. He renounced his wrath. He called it folly, ashes, the architect of his own despair. He would fight. The gifts Agamemnon had offered were irrelevant. He would fight for no prize but vengeance, for the right to kill Hector and then meet his own fate. It was not a reconciliation, but a merging of purposes. Agamemnon, seeing the terrifying void in the other man's eyes, merely nodded, any thought of pride or recompense extinguished by the sheer magnitude of the sorrow before him. The quarrel was over, drowned in a greater, darker sea. Achilles turned away, his mind already racing ahead to the only things that mattered now. New armor from the gods, and the moment he would step onto the plain to turn his grief into a harvest of Trojan blood. Dawn found Thetis at her son's side, the seas sent clinging to her as she laid the divine burden before him. Hephaestus had worked through the night, the forge fire of Olympus banked only when the masterpiece was complete. The armor gleamed not with a surface shine, but with a deep, internal light, as if capturing a piece of the firmament. The corselet was a second skin of articulated bronze, the greaves fitted like liquid metal, the helmet crested with a horsehair plume that seemed to stir in a wind that did not blow. But it was the shield that commanded silence. Forged from 5 layered plates of imperishable metal, its surface was a universe in miniature. Hephaestus had wrought upon it the totality of human existence, a panoramic vision of the world Achilles was about to renounce. At its center lay the earth, the sea, and the starry heavens. Circling this were 2 cities, one at peace, one at war. In the city of peace, a wedding procession wound through streets, dancers swirling, while elders sat in the agora settling a dispute over a blood price. In the city of war, an army besieged a wall. An ambush and strife stalked the fields beside the grim figure of death. Beyond the cities, scenes of pastoral life unfolded. A harvest, golden fields reaped by men while a king stood silently observing. A vineyard heavy with purple clusters, where youths and maidens gathered grapes in woven baskets. A herd of cattle attacked by lions, the bulls defending valiantly as herdsmen set their dogs on the predators, and a sheepfold in a lush meadow, a scene of perfect, bucolic tranquility. Further out, the god had hammered the image of a dancing floor like the one Daedalus once made, where youths and maidens whirled in an intricate, endless pattern. Encircling the very rim of the great disk was the mighty stream of Oceanus, the river that girdled the world. It was all there, the joy and the justice, the violence and the fruitfulness, the community and the individual struggle. The entire beautiful, tragic pageant of life. Achilles stared at this cosmic mirror. His own purpose, now refined to a single murderous point, vengeance for Patroclus, stood in stark, terrible contrast to the shield's expansive vision. He was choosing a path that led out of that world of weddings and harvests and dances into a solitary, focused darkness. The armor was a gift of divine power, but the shield was a reminder of all he was leaving behind. A final, breathtaking glimpse of the totality he would soon trade for the singularity of death. He began to arm himself. The greaves fitted with silver ankle clasps went on first, then the corselet, its weight a familiar promise of safety he now scorned. Over his shoulder he slung the sword with the silver-studded hilt. Lastly, he lifted the great shield. Its weight was immense, but he bore it easily, the scenes blurring into a swirl of metal as he settled it on his arm. Finally, he took up the heavy, long-shafted spear, its point a glinting star of bronze. When he placed the helmet upon his head, the world narrowed to the slit of the visor. The transformation was complete. The grieving man was gone, submerged within the divine panoply. He was now a weapon, a perfected instrument of fury. He stepped from his tent, and the Myrmidons, seeing the new, terrible radiance of him, felt awe and fear in equal measure. Achilles looked past them, toward the plain where Hector waited. The shield on his arm held a world, but his eyes saw only a single man, and the path between them, soon to be paved with corpses. Achilles emerged from the Myrmidon camp not as a man, but as a natural disaster given human form. The divine armor burned with a cold, terrible light, turning the dusty air around him to a shimmering haze. His first steps onto the plain were not steps, but impacts, each footfall seeming to shudder through the earth. He did not run. He advanced with a dreadful, deliberate pace, a predator whose prey was an entire army. His gaze, visible as a glint in the helmet's slit, was fixed on the distant walls of Troy, but his wrath encompassed everything between. The Trojans, still buoyed by the death of Patroclus and the wearing of the stolen armor, saw the approaching glare and felt their triumph curdle into primal terror. This was no semblance, no trick of polished bronze. This was the essence of the warrior they had feared for a decade, distilled to a pure, annihilating force. The front lines wavered, then broke before he even reached them, men scrambling over each other in their panic to flee. Achilles did not break stride. He entered the fray, and the slaughter began. It was not battle, it was harvest. His spear moved with a blinding, mechanical efficiency, a piston driving through flesh and bronze. He cut a crimson channel through the Trojan ranks, his path marked by a wake of twisted bodies and the keening of the dying. He fought in silence, a grim reaper whose only music was the wet crunch of his work. His relentless drive toward the city funneled the fleeing Trojans toward the river Scamander. The banks grew choked with men and horses, a panicked, struggling mass. Achilles followed them into the water, and the slaughter turned the flowing current to a thick, clotted red. The river god Scamander, rose in outrage at this defilement of his waters. The stream swelled, its banks overflowing, waves rising not from wind but from divine anger, seeking to drown the murderer. Achilles, empowered by Hephaestus's fire, fought the river itself, a surreal duel of man against nature. Flames sprang from the plain to boil the gods' waters, steam hissing in a great cloud until Scamander, overwhelmed, subsided with a groan. Achilles climbed from the steaming, blood-frothed river, unstoppable. He resumed his advance, a force of singular momentum. He was no longer hunting soldiers. He was seeking a single soul. Every life he took was merely an obstacle removed between himself and Hector. He moved like a comet, dragging a tail of devastation behind him, his eyes scanning the chaos for the gleam of his own stolen armor. The Trojan army shattered like glass before a hammer, its cohesion lost, its spirit broken. The plain became a tableau of his focused rage, a landscape sculpted by grief and vengeance. Nothing could stand before him. The walls of Troy loomed closer, and his pace did not slow, for he knew the man he sought was there behind them, wearing the shell of his glory. The momentum was terrifying, inevitable. A boulder dropped from a great height, and at the bottom of its arc waited Hector, and the final, crushing impact of fate. Hector stood alone before the Scaean gate, a solitary figure against the immense, pale stone. The great walls of Troy, his life's charge and his people's shield, rose behind him. He had watched from the ramparts as Achilles carved his red path across the plain, scattering the Trojan army like chaff. A terrible clarity settled upon him. To retreat inside now would be to condemn the city to a slow siege under the shadow of this fury. To stand and fight was to die. He chose to stand. His parents, Priam and Hecuba, cried out to him from above, their voices thin with despair, begging him to seek the safety of the walls. He did not heed them. His hand tightened on his spear, his eyes on the approaching storm of bronze and rage. Achilles came on like a coming night, swift and dark. The sight of his own armor, the glorious panoply forged by Hephaestus, now encasing the man who had killed Patroclus, ignited a final, white-hot core within his grief. He charged. Hector's courage, deep and true, wavered for the first and only time. A primal fear seized him, and he turned and fled. The chase began. 3 times around the great circuit of Troy's walls they ran, the swift-footed Achilles and the desperate prince, their feet pounding the hard-packed earth. The dust rose in plumes behind them. It was a grotesque parody of the chariot races held in times of peace, a mortal circuit with death at the shoulder. The gods watched from Olympus. Athena, fierce partisan of the Greeks, descended. Taking the form of Hector's beloved brother Deiphobus, she appeared at his side, promising to stand with him and fight. Heartened by this phantom of brotherly aid, Hector turned to make his stand. He faced Achilles, his spear raised. He spoke, his voice steady, proposing a pact, that the victor would return the loser's body for proper rites. Achilles' reply was a snarl of pure hatred, his eyes blazing through his helmet's slit. There were no pacts between lions and men, he said. No oaths could bind his vengeance. Then he cast his spear. Hector crouched, and it flew harmlessly past. Unseen by Hector, Athena retrieved it and returned it to Achilles' hand. Hector, believing his brother was beside him, called to the empty air for a second spear. There was only silence. He knew then he was alone, tricked by divinity. There was no retreat. Drawing his sword, he rushed forward, a final, magnificent act of defiance. Achilles, cold and perfect in his wrath, waited. He saw the gap in the armor, the very armor he knew so well, where the collarbone met the throat, a spot left vulnerable by the strap of the stolen helmet. As Hector lunged, Achilles drove his spear point home with all the gathered force of his grief and rage. The bronze pierced flesh, found the windpipe and emerged clean. Hector fell, the dust rising softly around him. The life fled from his eyes, but with his last, gurgling breath, he made one final plea. He begged, for the sake of his parents and his son, that his body be ransomed and returned to Troy, not left for the dogs and birds. Achilles, kneeling in the dirt beside him, wiped his spear point on the fallen prince's tunic. His answer was a flat, absolute negation. He would let the dogs devour Hector's flesh, he said, and even if Priam brought his weight in gold, it would not buy back the corpse. Then he set to the final, grisly work of his vengeance. He stripped his own magnificent armor from Hector's body, reclaiming it. From the fallen prince's ankles, he cut long strips of tough ox hide. He passed them through the tendons just above the heels. Then, tying the other ends to the chariot rail of his waiting war car, he mounted. With a shout to his immortal horses, he whipped them forward. The body of Hector, Prince of Troy, defender of the city, caught and jerked, then began to bounce and drag behind the speeding chariot. A cloud of fine, pale dust rose from the plain, enveloping the terrible procession. Achilles drove him past the watching Greek lines, past the silent, horrified ranks of Trojans on the walls, around the tomb of Patroclus, the corpse becoming a shapeless, broken thing, its dark hair fanning out in the dirt, its once noble face erased by the relentless abrasion of the earth. The dust coated everything, the chariot, the horses, the triumphant grieving. Killer. It was a desecration beyond murder, a symbolic annihilation meant to extend beyond death, ensuring Hector's shade would find no rest, only an eternity of dragging through the dust. The desecration stretched into days. Each dawn, Achilles would harness his horses and drag the broken body of Hector around the tomb of Patroclus, a grim, daily ritual to feed his unsated grief. The corpse, by divine intervention, remained untouched by decay or scavengers, a preserved testament to the ongoing insult. In Troy, the wailing never ceased. King Priam, aged and broken, could no longer bear the sound of his people's mourning or the sight of his son's defilement from the walls. A resolve, fragile and desperate, hardened within him. He would go himself. He would enter the lion's den and beg for the body of his child. The gods approved. Hermes, the guide of souls, was dispatched. As midnight draped the world, the messenger god, disguised as a young Myrmidon captain, found the old king and his herald, Idaeus, already beyond the walls, their wagon laden with a king's ransom, finely woven robes, ingots of gold and iron, cauldrons and tripods. Hermes guided them unseen through the sleeping Greek sentries, past the trenches and the black hulls of the ships, his staff casting a veil of drowsy forgetfulness over any who stirred. They moved through the enemy camp as through a land of shadows, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the old king's labored breath. They arrived at the great hut of Achilles. Hermes revealed himself briefly, a shimmer in the night air, then vanished, his task complete. Priam, alone now with his mission, pushed aside the heavy door curtain and entered. The interior was lit by a single, low-burning hearth. Achilles sat across the room, his meal unfinished before him. His companions, Agamemnon and Alcimus, froze at the sight of the Trojan king materializing from the night. Priam did not hesitate. He crossed the floor, and before Achilles could rise, the old man knelt and clasped the warrior's knees, then brought his hands to his lips and kissed those terrible, murderous hands. The air left the room. Priam spoke, his voice a dry whisper of leaves. He did not plead as a king, but as a father. He spoke of Achilles' own father, Peleus, waiting in distant Phthia, hoping against hope for his son's return. He, Priam, had no such hope. He had lost so many sons, and now his best, his protector, lay defiled in the dust. He begged Achilles to think of his own father, to feel a spark of pity, and to accept the ransom for Hector's body. Achilles looked down at the gray head bowed at his knees, at the hands that kissed his own, and something vast and stony within him finally cracked. He thought of Peleus and of Patroclus, whom he would never ransom. A great sob welled up in his chest. He took the old king's hands and gently raised him, guiding him to a seat of honor. He ordered a meal prepared, insisting Priam eat and drink, for no mortal could endure such sorrow without sustenance. They shared food in silence, a communion of grief across the chasm of war. Achilles' anger, that cosmic fire that had fueled him for so long, cooled into embers and ash. He agreed to the ransom. He promised a truce of 11 days for Hector's funeral rites. He himself lifted Hector's cleansed and anointed body, now wrapped in fine linens, and placed it tenderly upon the wagon with Priam's help. He saw the old king and his heralds safely on their way, his heart strangely quiet. As the wagon disappeared into the pre-dawn gloom, Achilles walked to the shore. He stared at the dark, endless sea, thinking of his father and of his friend, and of the peace he had just granted his enemy, wondering if this, and not the rage or the glory, was the final, truest weight of being human. The pyre's ashes had cooled to a gray mound, and the Myrmidons had raised a barrow over the bones of Patroclus. A strange, suspended quiet settled over the Greek camp. The relentless engine of vengeance that had driven Achilles was, for the moment, stilled. In its place arose a different imperative: ceremony. To honor his friend, Achilles announced funeral games. It was a deliberate invocation of an older world, a temporary restoration of the codes of honor and competition that had existed before the war's personal bitterness. The plain before Troy, so recently a slaughterhouse, was cleared and marked for contests. A semblance of normalcy, fragile and profound, was summoned from the air. The first and grandest event was the chariot race. Princes and kings rolled their finest cars to the starting line: Diomedes, Menelaus, Antilochus, Merions, and Eumelus. The prizes were laid out for all to see: a skilled woman and a tripod for the winner, down to a two-handled cup for 5th place. The tension was not of battle, but of sport, a clean, focused strain. At the signal, the horses lunged forward, their hooves throwing great clods of earth, the chariots rattling and bouncing over the uneven ground. Dust plumed in their wake, not the dust of dragging a corpse, but of honest speed. Diomedes, with his divine horses, took an early lead, but Antilochus, driving with reckless daring, nearly forced Menelaus off the track in a thrilling, controversial move. The finish was a blur of sweat and foam and flying manes. Achilles, presiding, awarded the prizes with solemn fairness, even mediating the heated dispute between Antilochus and Menelaus with a kingly wisdom that seemed borrowed from a forgotten self. The quarrel was settled, honor satisfied, the natural order of merit restored. Next came boxing, a brutal, straightforward test. Two massive men, Epeius and Euryalus, bound their hands with ox-hide straps and faced each other. The blows were heavy, meaty thuds that echoed in the still air. There was no malice in it, only a testing of strength and endurance. Epeius won, his opponent's face swollen but unmarked by hatred. The winner raised his arms, and the crowd cheered not for death dealt, but for prowess displayed. Wrestling followed, a grappling match of immense skill and patience between the greater Ajax and the cunning Odysseus. They strained in the dust, their muscles corded, the earth worn smooth beneath them. The match ended in a draw, and Achilles declared both men equal victors, awarding dual prizes. It was a moment of perfect balance, a recognition that different kinds of strength could coexist. There were foot races, tests of archery and spear throwing, each contest a thread weaving back a torn social fabric. The heroes competed not for survival but for gleaming prizes, cauldrons, tripods, horses, gold, and for the public acknowledgement of their worth. Achilles moved among them, distributing the awards with a grave courtesy. The terrible grief in his eyes was still present, but it was framed now by ritual, given a shape and a purpose outside of destruction. For a single, sun-drenched day, the war receded. The games were a mirror held up to peace, reflecting a world where conflict had rules, where excellence was rewarded, and where men could strive against each other without seeking mutual annihilation. It was a fleeting illusion, a beautiful, poignant lie. As the sun dipped toward the western sea and the final prizes were given, the shadows lengthened across the plain, reaching once more toward the walls of Troy. The games were over. The pause in the violence ended. The brief, ordered echo of the world they had left behind faded, and the relentless tide of fate, momentarily held at bay, began its slow, inevitable return. The prophecy was a cold stone in the heart of the war, known to all but spoken in whispers. Hector was dead and dishonored, yet Troy's walls still stood. The final clause of the oracle remained. After Hector, Achilles must fall. A strange, fatalistic energy crackled around the son of Peleus in the days that followed the funeral games. He fought with a reckless, sublime fury, as if racing his own doom, driving the Trojans back to their gates again and again. Yet even in his divine armor, he was a man, and every man has a flaw woven into his making. His mother Thetis had known. When she dipped the infant Achilles in the river Styx to render him invulnerable, the heel by which she held him remained untouched by the sacred waters, a tiny patch of mortal vulnerability on an otherwise impervious body. It was the secret hinge of his destiny, the crack through which fate would always find its way. Apollo, the archer god whose wrath had begun this phase of the war, had not forgotten his grudge against the Greeks, nor his patronage of Troy. He watched from the cloudy heights as Achilles, on yet another day of slaughter, stormed toward the Scaean gate, his intent clear: to breach the city itself, to turn prophecy on its head through sheer force of will. But the gods enforce the balance. As Achilles fought before the gate, his spear a blur of death, Apollo descended to the ramparts. He did not come in glory, but as a guiding whisper in the ear of Paris, the prince whose judgment had begun it all. Paris, ever the archer, ever the instrument of divine will, knocked an arrow to his bow. His skill was considerable, but against the raging demigod below it was nothing. Yet Apollo, unseen, laid a hand upon the fletching. He did not aim the shot, but he guided its flight, bending the air around it, ensuring its path would be true. The arrow, a slender shaft of ash tipped with bronze, flew from the wall. It did not seek the gleaming breastplate or the helmet's crest. It arced, almost lazily, and found the one place the armor did not cover, the one spot where Achilles was as vulnerable as any newborn, the back of his right heel. The impact was not dramatic. It was a sharp, sudden sting like the bite of a serpent. Achilles stumbled, his forward momentum arrested. He looked down, saw the shaft protruding from his foot, and understood. Instantly, a cold numbness, swift and total, spread from the wound up through his leg into his core. It was not a mortal poison, but the touch of fate itself. His strength, that boundless river, drained away in a heartbeat. The great spear slipped from his grasp, clattering on the stones. He fell to one knee, then onto his side, the dust of the plain he had dominated rising in a small cloud around him. There was no final speech, no cry to the heavens. His eyes, wide with shock, fixed on the distant, uncaring walls of Troy, then glazed over, seeing nothing. The light that had burned so fiercely for 24 years was extinguished. The greatest of the Greeks was dead. A silence more profound than any battle lull fell across the field. Then the roar went up, of Trojan triumph and Greek despair. The two sides converged on the fallen hero, not in combat, but in a frantic, savage tug-of-war over the ultimate prize, his corpse and his divine armor. The battle that erupted around his body was among the fiercest of the war, a churning maelstrom of men fighting not for ground, but for a symbol. Ajax the Greater and Odysseus, fighting side by side with a desperate ferocity, finally managed to heave the body onto their shoulders, and with a wall of Greeks holding back the tide, bear it back to the ships. The armor, claimed by the Trojans in the chaos, became a bitter trophy. That night the Greek camp was a place of stunned desolation. Thetis emerged from the sea with her sister Nereids, their lamentations a dirge that merged with the weeping of the Myrmidons. They washed the body, anointed it with ambrosia, and clad it in clean, fine linens. They built his pyre not of common wood, but of fragrant cedar and pine, stacking it high on the shore. They placed upon it the bodies of 12 captured Trojan princes, a grim honor guard for his journey. Patroclus's bones were exhumed and placed beside him, so they might be mingled in the ash. As the first torch was set to the resinous wood, the flames leaped skyward with a roar, a column of fire and smoke visible from the walls of Troy. For 17 days and nights the Greeks mourned, quenching the embers with wine and gathering the bones into a golden urn. A tomb was raised beside that of Patroclus, a twin barrow that would forever mark the shore where the heart of the war had finally, irrevocably, ceased to beat. The glory was ashes. The wrath was spent. All that remained was the long, grim business of victory, now shadowed by an immeasurable loss. The death of Achilles left the Greek host stranded in a morass of despair. The walls of Troy, though scarred, stood unbroken. The war had consumed its brightest flame and seemed no closer to ending. In this stagnant gloom, the captured Trojan seer Helenus, brother of Hector, was compelled to speak. Through him, a new, bitter prophecy was wrung from the reluctant fates. Troy could not fall without the bow of Heracles, the weapon of the greatest hero of an earlier age was required to breach the citadel of the new. But the bow was not in an armory. It was in the hands of a man the Greeks had abandoned, a living ghost festering on a lonely island. Years before, on the voyage to Troy, the fleet had stopped at the Isle of Lemnos. There, the archer Philoctetes, keeper of Heracles' bow, had been bitten by a serpent. The wound did not heal. It suppurated, emitting a foul odor and agonizing pain. His screams and the stench of his rotting flesh became unbearable to the army. On the advice of Odysseus, the Greeks had marooned him there, leaving him with only the bow and a few supplies, a cruel mercy in the name of collective comfort. Now, that discarded man held the key to their victory. Odysseus, the architect of the original abandonment, was tasked with the retrieval. He chose as his companion Neoptolemus, the young son of Achilles, newly arrived from Scyros to claim his father's armor and his place in the war. The youth was all martial, purity and honor, a stark contrast to the older man's labyrinthine mind. Their voyage to Lemnos was tense and silent, a journey into the conscience of the expedition. They found the island as bleak as memory, wind-scoured rocks, stunted trees, and a pervasive silence broken only by the cry of gulls. They discovered Philoctetes not in a shelter, but in a cave mouth, a wretched figure hunched over a fire. His clothes were rags, his hair and beard a wild tangle. His face was gaunt, etched with years of solitary pain and betrayal. The famous bow lay beside him, its polished wood gleaming incongruously against the squalor. Odysseus, knowing the bitter man would never willingly help those who had left him to die, devised a plan. Neoptolemus, with his honest face and his father's name, was to approach alone, spinning a tale of grievance against the Greek leaders, particularly Odysseus, to win Philoctetes' trust and steal the bow. The young prince played his part with a growing, palpable sickness of heart. He found Philoctetes in the throes of a paroxysm of pain, the old wound weeping and foul. The abandoned man's joy at seeing another human face, especially the son of his admired Achilles, was pathetic and profound. He clasped Neoptolemus's hands with trembling, fever-hot fingers, pouring out his loneliness and his unwavering hatred for Odysseus and the Atreidae. Neoptolemus listened, the lie curdling in his mouth. He was a warrior, not an actor. The deception felt like a stain on his father's honor. Yet under Odysseus's hidden, insistent gaze, he persisted, weaving the false story. Philoctetes, desperate for companionship and justice, believed him utterly. In a moment of heartbreaking trust, he handed the young man the sacred bow to hold, asking him to keep it safe from any sudden attack. The weapon's weight was the weight of the war and of a great wrong. Neoptolemus stood holding the bow, Philoctetes' grateful eyes upon him. The conflict within the youth became unbearable. The sight of the suffering man, his simple, betrayed faith, shattered the pretense. As Odysseus emerged from hiding to claim their prize, Neoptolemus broke. He confessed the ruse, his voice thick with shame, and thrust the bow back into Philoctetes' astonished hands. A rage of betrayal deeper than the first seized the archer. He leveled the weapon, not at Odysseus, but at his own heart, preferring death to further manipulation. It was then that the Deus ex machina arrived, not as a god descending, but as the ghost of Heracles himself, appearing in a blaze of light. The long-dead hero commanded his friend Philoctetes to go to Troy. There, he said, the great healer Asclepius's sons would cure his wound, and with his bow he would win immortal glory and finally end the war. The command from beyond the grave, from the very hero whose bow he carried, broke Philoctetes' resolve. The bitterness did not vanish, but it was overlaid by a higher duty. With a last, long look at his desolate home of 10 years, he allowed himself to be led to the ship. At Troy, the prophecy was fulfilled. The sons of Asclepius tended the rancid wound, cleaning it with wine and applying healing salves. The pain, a constant companion for a decade, receded, leaving a man weak but whole. When the Trojan forces next massed on the plain, Philoctetes stood with the Greek ranks. He strung the great bow of Heracles, the sinew creaking with a memory of strength. He drew back, his arms remembering their old skill, and let fly. The arrow, guided by fate and vengeance, found its mark. Paris, the cause of it all, the prince who had stolen Helen and whose arrow had killed Achilles. The shaft struck him down, a poetic circle closed. With the death of Paris, one last thread of Trojan hope was severed. The bow had spoken. The final act of the siege could now begin, propelled by the reclaimed power of a hero once left for dead. His bitterness healed only so it could be turned with perfect tragic irony against the city. The final, mystical precondition for Troy's fall remained. Deep within the citadel, in the innermost sanctum of Athena's temple, stood the Palladium, a small, ancient wooden statue of the goddess, arms raised, holding spear and spindle. It was believed that while this talisman remained within the walls, the city itself stood under divine protection, impervious to sack. The prophecy was absolute. The statue must be stolen. The task demanded not brute force, but a perfect, silent violation. Odysseus, whose mind thrived in shadows, and Diomedes, whose nerve was as steady as his sword arm, were chosen once more for the work of night. They left the camp under the cover of a moonless, starless sky, the kind of dark that feels like a substance. This was not a raid for horses, but a sacrilegious burglary in the very heart of the enemy. They blackened their limbs with ash and river mud, wore dark, close-fitting tunics, and carried only short blades and coiled ropes. Their path was not across the open plain, but along a treacherous, little-known route Odysseus had gleaned from interrogated prisoners. A fissure in the bedrock beneath the southwestern wall, a forgotten drain from the city's founding, now choked with rubble and filth. The approach was a slow, agonizing crawl through cold, wet stone, the air thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. Emerging inside the walls was like being swallowed. The silence of the sleeping city was profound, a blanket over the distant murmur of the sea. They moved through deserted alleyways, shadows among deeper shadows, their senses straining. Every sleeping dog was a sentry, every shift of a shutter in the night whined a warning. The citadel loomed above, a darker mass against the dark sky. They avoided the guarded gates, scaling a sheer section of the inner bastion where the masonry was oldest and most uneven, finding fingerholds in the joins between the great stones. The climb was a test of will, each upward. Pull a potential giveaway, the drop below a silent promise of discovery and a messy death. They reached the summit, slipping over the parapet onto the sacred precinct. The Temple of Athena was before them, a low, colonnaded structure of pale marble that seemed to glow with its own faint, cold light in the gloom. The doors were barred, but a high, narrow window, meant for ventilation, offered a sliver of access. Odysseus, the smaller of the two, boosted Diomedes onto his shoulders. With infinite care, Diomedes wedged himself through the opening, his body scraping against the stone, and dropped soundlessly onto the marble floor within. The interior was pitch black and smelled of old incense, myrrh, and the faint, dry scent of the olive wood of the statue itself. His eyes adjusted slowly. There, upon a simple altar at the far end, stood the Palladium. It was smaller than he had imagined, no taller than a child, but its presence filled the space. It was not beautiful in a conventional sense. The carving was archaic, severe, the face of the goddess impassive and eternal. Yet it hummed with a palpable power, the accumulated faith of centuries. To touch it felt like a violation of the natural order. Diomedes approached, his breath held. He could hear the slow, measured tread of a single priestess in an adjoining chamber, the soft shuffle of her sandals a metronome in the night. He reached out. His fingers, calloused from spear and shield, closed around the slender wooden form. It was surprisingly light. As he lifted it from its stand, a sudden, silent chill swept through the temple, as if the very air mourned the loss. He turned, statue cradled against his chest, and made for the window. Outside, Odysseus helped him down. They did not pause. The return was a nightmare of compressed time, every second stretching, every echo magnified. Descending the wall was harder, the precious burden limiting Diomedes's grip. They retraced their path through the silent streets, past the still houses, the statue now a secret burning between them. Only when they slipped back into the dank throat of the drainage fissure, the city walls at their backs, did they allow a shuddering breath. They emerged onto the plain as the first faint hint of gray touched the eastern horizon. They carried no spoils of gold, only a small, ancient piece of carved wood. But in their hands they held the spiritual keystone of Troy. The city's divine protection was gone, leaving only stone and mortal men to face what was to come. The theft was complete, a silent surgery performed in the dark, and the patient, still sleeping, was now terminally vulnerable. The final stratagem did not arrive as a thunderclap of inspiration, but as a slow, cold crystallization in the mind of Odysseus. For 10 years, force had failed. Cunning had won moments, but not the war. The theft of the Palladium had removed the divine shield, yet the mortal walls remained, manned by weary but resolute defenders. The answer Odysseus saw must be a thing of perfect, deceptive beauty, a gift that was a weapon, an offering that was a coffin. It must be a symbol so potent it would bypass reason and speak directly to the Trojans' exhausted desire for relief, for an end. He envisioned a shape, massive, hollow, wooden, a horse. The construction began at once, in a secluded cove away from the main camp under a shroud of secrecy. The sound that filled the air was not the clash of arms, but the relentless, rhythmic rasp of saws biting into fresh-cut pine. The scent was not of blood and smoke, but of sap and sawdust, a clean, sharp perfume that felt alien after a decade of rot and metal. The Greeks, under the direction of Epeius, a master carpenter, worked with a focused, silent intensity. They selected the tallest, straightest trees from the foothills of Ida, felling them with a reverence usually reserved for temple beams. The horse took form day by day, a monstrous, graceful artifice. Its legs were thick, as temple columns, carved with intricate muscle and tendon. Its neck arched proudly, its head turned slightly as if scenting the wind, eyes fashioned from polished obsidian that caught the light with a knowing gleam. The belly was a cavern, accessed through a cunningly hidden trapdoor in its flank, large enough to hold 30 of the hardiest Greek warriors. The wood, still green and weeping sap, was smoothed and sanded until it shone like tawny gold in the sunlight. It stood as tall as the city gates it was meant to breach, an idol to no known god, a masterpiece of false peace. While the horse grew on the beach, the rest of the Greek camp enacted the second act of the deception. With a great show of despair and disorder, they began to break camp. Tents were struck, goods packed onto wagons. The ships, long beached and rotting, were dragged back into the shallows. The sails, patched and faded, were unfurled. To the Trojan watchers on the walls, it appeared as a miracle. The siege was ending. The Greeks, broken by the loss of Achilles and the failure of their final assaults, were abandoning the war. A collective, breathless hope surged through the beleaguered city. The sight of the first ships actually setting sail, their prows turning westward toward home, was a physical release of tension. Cheers, faint and disbelieving, echoed from the ramparts. They left the horse behind, solitary and immense on the deserted shore. Before it they built a rough altar of sea-smoothed stones. Scattered around its hooves were the discarded detritus of a fleeing army, broken spear shafts, a cracked shield, empty wineskins, a stage set of defeat. The horse stood as an offering to Athena, a plea for safe passage home, or so the single, carefully planted man left behind would claim. The Greek fleet did not sail far. Just beyond the curve of the headland, past the island of Tenedos, they dropped anchor in a hidden bay, their sails furled, their oars shipped. The 1,000 ships became a silent, waiting forest of masts in the twilight, the men aboard them holding their breath, their eyes fixed on the darkening shore where their hollow idol stood, a Trojan gift pregnant with Greek fire. The vision was complete. The trap was set. All that remained was for Troy to choose its own destruction, to welcome the beautiful, wooden poison into its heart. The Trojans streamed from the Scaean gate at dawn, a river of disbelief and burgeoning joy. They poured onto the silent, trampled plain, past the abandoned earthworks and cold fire pits, toward the solitary, colossal wonder left upon the shore. The wooden horse stood in majestic silence, its shadow long in the morning sun, an artifact of such scale and artistry it seemed a gift from the gods themselves. Awe hushed the crowd. Then the debates began, a babble of speculation and relief. Was it a trophy? A propitiatory offering? A sign of Athena's favor finally turned to them. The air, so long heavy with dread, now fizzed with a dangerous, giddy hope. The first voice of warning cut through the murmur like a blade. Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, thrust his way to the front. His face was etched with a prophet's grim certainty. He pointed a trembling finger at the horse's gleaming flanks. He spoke of Greek guile, of gifts that were not gifts. His words were stark and terrible. He feared the Greeks, he said, even when they brought presents. The thing was a trick, an engine of deceit. He implored them to burn it, to pierce its hollow belly with spears, to reject this poisoned bounty. To emphasize his point, he took a heavy spear from a guard and with all his strength hurled it at the horse's side. The point struck deep into the wood with a resonant asterisk thunk that echoed across the beach, a sound that seemed to hold a muffled, human gasp within it. A collective shudder passed through the crowd. Then the sea answered. From the calm, blue waters of the strait, two immense, coiling serpents emerged. Their scales were the color of tarnished bronze, their bodies thicker than a man's thigh. They moved with a horrific, silent speed, their undulating forms cutting across the sand, heading unerringly for Laocoon and his two young sons who stood beside him. The crowd screamed and scattered. The priest turned, his defiance melting into terror. The serpents wrapped around the three figures with crushing force, their coils a living, constricting prison. Laocoon's roar of agony was cut short as the sinuous bodies tightened, folding father and sons together in a grotesque, suffocating embrace. The monsters' heads darted, biting with venomous fangs. Within moments, the struggle ceased. The serpents, their work done, slid back into the sea and vanished. The three bodies lay broken and still in the sand, a divine punctuation to the priest's warning. The message was interpreted not as a validation of his caution, but as a punishment for his sacrilege against Athena's supposed offering. A fearful, reverent silence fell. It was then they found the other man. Hiding in the reeds by the altar was a single, pitiful Greek, his clothes torn, his face etched with what appeared to be abject terror. The guards dragged him forward. His name, he wept, was Sinon. He spun his tale with the desperate conviction of a condemned man. He was an outcast, he said, a victim of Odysseus's malice. The Greeks, upon the advice of the seer Calchas, had chosen him as a sacrificial victim to ensure fair winds for their retreat. He had escaped, hiding until they were gone. The horse, he explained through shuddering sobs, was indeed an offering to Athena, built to atone for the theft of the Palladium. But it was made deliberately huge, he confessed, so the Trojans could not possibly drag it inside their walls. For if they did, the goddess's favor would pass irrevocably from Greece to Troy, making their city invincible for ages to come. It was a masterstroke of reverse psychology, weaving truth with lie, playing upon Trojan pride and their yearning for divine sanction. The crowd hung on every word. Sinon's performance was flawless, the trembling limbs, the tears of genuine fear, for he knew the fate awaiting him if his ruse failed. The artful revelation of the secret meant to deter them. The death of Laocoon seemed to confirm his story. The gods had struck down the man who would desecrate their idol. The debate among the Trojans, which had moments before been between caution and curiosity, now turned between joyous acceptance and triumphant defiance. King Priam, moved by Sinon's tale and the apparent omen, gave the order. Ropes were fetched, rollers laid. With shouts of effort and celebration, the people of Troy laid hands on the ropes. They began to pull the vast, hollow horse toward their city, straining like ants moving a mountain. It inched forward, its wooden wheels groaning, its shadow falling across the threshold of the gate it was destined to destroy. They breached their own walls willingly, dragging the instrument of their doom into the heart of the citadel, while above, the unblinking obsidian eyes of the horse stared down, holding its silent, deadly secret. A celebration such as Troy had not known in a decade erupted within the walls. The strain of 10 years, a taut wire humming with dread, snapped into a wild, discordant music of relief. The great horse stood in the very center of the citadel, a silent, towering guest of honor, its wooden flanks garlanded with flowers and ribbons by laughing women. Wine, hoarded for years, flowed from jars into cups, into mouths, onto the dusty streets. The scent of roasting meat from 100 impromptu feasts overpowered the old, familiar smells of sweat and smoke and fear. Men embraced, not as comrades in a grim duty, but as survivors of a long nightmare. They sang old songs, the words half remembered, their voices cracking with disuse and emotion. Children who had known nothing but the shadow of the siege danced in the flickering torchlight, their movements unburdened by memory. The city, for the first night in 10 years, did not sleep. It exhaled. But exhaustion, deeper than any wine-induced stupor, eventually claimed them. As the moon climbed to its zenith, the music faltered. The songs gave way to murmurs, then to the deep, rhythmic breathing of sleep. The revelers slumped where they sat, in doorways, against walls, across tables. The streets, so recently thronged, grew still, littered with discarded cups and the bones of the feast. Torches guttered and died, plunging the city into pockets of profound darkness. The silence that descended was not peaceful, but thick and heavy, the silence of a collective spent hope. Guards posted at the gates and along the ramparts nodded at their stations, their vigilance softened by the pervasive belief that the watch was, at last, a formality. The war was over. The city slept, a deep, trusting sleep, dreaming of tomorrows unshaped by the rumble of Greek chariots. Out on the wine-dark sea, beyond the black silhouette of Tenedos, no one slept. The Greek fleet had returned with oars muffled by wool, cutting through the water with a ghost silence. No lantern gleamed on their decks, no bronze clanged. They were a shadow armada, sliding back toward the shore they had pretended to abandon. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic dip of paddles and the gentle sigh of waves against dark hulls. Their eyes were fixed on the high bulk of the city, a deeper black against the starry sky. They watched for a single, tiny light. Inside the citadel, Sinon waited. The tears and tremors were gone, replaced by a cold, focused stillness. He moved through the sleeping city like a wraith, avoiding the moonlit squares, sticking to the alleys where the darkness was absolute. He came to a prearranged spot on the western wall, a section less frequented, overlooking the Scamander's plain. From a hidden pouch he drew flint and steel. A single, sharp crack. Swallowed by the night, a spark caught on a twist of oiled linen. He shielded the tiny flame with his body, letting it grow, then lifted it high once, twice, 3 times, a fleeting golden pulse against the immense dark. The signal was sent. On the shore, men saw the brief, answering flicker. The trap, sprung 10 years before with a golden apple, was now finally armed. The wooden horse, standing amidst the dreaming city, ceased to be an offering and became a tomb, its hollow belly holding its breath, waiting for the night to crack open. A faint, metallic scrape echoed within the hollow belly of the horse, a sound like a key turning in a long-locked door. The trapdoor in the flank swung open, a black rectangle in the moon-pale wood. A rope uncoiled, its end whispering against the garlanded side. One by one, shadows detached themselves from the greater shadow within and slid down to the silent, deserted square. Odysseus first, then Menelaus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, and the rest, 30 men in total, their bronze greased to stifle any gleam, their faces smeared with soot. They moved like extensions of the night itself, fanning out with a grim, rehearsed purpose. Their first objective, the gates. The city was a labyrinth of stillness and shallow breath. They passed slumped revelers, their faces slack in sleep, unaware of the ghosts moving among them. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic crash of the sea and the occasional snore from an open window. The tension was a wire drawn to singing tautness in each man's chest. Every footfall, however carefully placed, seemed an explosion in the profound quiet. They reached the Scaean gate. The guards there were few, their vigilance dissolved by celebration and wine. One leaned against his spear, eyes closed. The work was swift and silent, a hand clamped over a mouth, a blade drawn across a throat, a body lowered softly to the stones. No cry was raised. The great bar, a tree trunk of oak banded with bronze, was lifted from its brackets by many hands, its weight borne in utter silence. The massive doors groaned inward on their hinges, a low, deep sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. From the dark plain beyond, a sea of men began to flow through the open gate. The main Greek army, returned from Tenedos, poured into Troy. They came not in a roaring charge, but in a relentless, silent flood, a black river filling the streets. Only when their numbers were deep within the city, when escape was impossible, did the silence shatter. The first torch was thrown. It arced through the night, a comet of orange, and landed on a thatched roof near the palace. The dry straw caught with a soft asterisk whump, flames leaping skyward with a hungry crackle. That sound was the starter's pistol. Suddenly, the night erupted. The sensory chaos was absolute, overwhelming, a tidal wave of annihilation. Sight, fire, the great devourer, became the city's new master. It raced along rooftops, climbed wooden columns, bloomed from windows. The towering horse was silhouetted against a hellish orange backdrop. Shadows, monstrous and leaping, danced on every wall. The gleam of bronze was now the gleam of weapons in the firelight, rising and falling. Sound, a cacophony that had no single source. The screams began, high, piercing shrieks of women, the raw bellows of men surprised and dying, the terrified wails of children. Underneath it all was the relentless, brutal music of metal, the clash of sword on shield, the crunch of spear through bone, the thud of axes on doors. Roaring commands mixed with wordless cries of rage and agony. The very air seemed to vibrate with the noise of a civilization being unmade. Smell, the clean scent of the celebratory feasts, was obliterated. Now it was the acrid, choking stench of smoke, the metallic tang of blood soaking into the dust, the greasy odor of burning wood and pitch, and beneath it, the first sickly sweet hint of burning flesh. Touch, heat blasted. From the infernos, a physical wall, ash, white and soft as snow, began to fall, coating everything. The cobbles underfoot grew slick with spilled wine and darker fluids. Men stumbled over bodies, warm and cooling alike. There were no individual heroics in this narrative, only the mechanics of sack. Greeks burst into homes, not for treasure first, but for death. A Trojan warrior fumbling for his sword by his bedside was cut down before he could stand. An old man, clutching a small statue of a household god, was shoved into his own hearth. The chaos was democratic in its brutality. It consumed the noble and the commoner, the warrior and the artisan, in the same fiery maw. The orderly world of streets and houses became a charnel house, a labyrinth of flame and slaughter. The high walls which had defined and protected Troy for generations now served only to trap its people inside with the catastrophe. The sack was not a battle but a harvest of fire and iron, the logical, brutal conclusion to a decade of pent-up fury. The civilization of Troy did not fall with a single symbolic crash. It dissolved into a million sensory fragments, a scream cut short, a tapestry blooming with flame, a cup of gold dropped into a pool of red, the deafening, overwhelming roar of an ending world. The final, systematic dismantling of the royal house was not an act of battle frenzy, but of cold, symbolic erasure. The Greeks, their bloodlust tempered now by a grim sense of ritual, sought the last pillars of the Trojan state. King Priam, the aged heart of the city, had sought sanctuary at the household altar of Zeus Hercules in the central courtyard of his palace. The altar was a simple, blood-stained block of stone, where for decades he had made offerings for the safety of his city and his countless sons. Now he clung to it as a raft in a storm of fire and screams, his royal robes hastily thrown over a trembling frame, a circlet of gold still upon his white hair. He was not praying, but waiting, his eyes fixed on the empty, smoke-streaked sky, as if expecting the god to descend and honor the ancient pact of sanctuary. He did not see Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, enter the courtyard. The young warrior, his father's armor gleaming with fresh blood, moved with a terrifying, purposeful calm. He did not shout or rage. He saw the old king at the altar, a tableau of sacred supplication, and his stride did not break. The sanctity of the place meant nothing to him. It was just another piece of Trojan stone. Priam turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting those of the youth who so resembled his greatest enemy. There was no plea in his gaze, only a vast, exhausted resignation. Neoptolemus did not speak. He stepped forward, seized the king by his white hair, and dragged him from the altar's base. The old man offered no resistance, his body a brittle husk. With a single, brutal stroke of his sword, Neoptolemus ended the line of Dardanus at the very foot of the god's altar. The king's blood, dark and thin, seeped into the cracks of the sacred stone, mingling with the ancient offerings of bulls and lambs. The protector of the city was dead, and the god remained silent, his altar just another killing floor. The next target was a future king. Hector's infant son, Astyanax, lord of the city, was a child of perhaps 2 years, a symbol of Trojan hope and continuity. He was found in the arms of his nurse, hidden in the women's quarters of the shattered palace. The Greeks did not see a child, they saw a seed from which a new Hector might grow, a future avenger who would one day seek to rebuild the walls they had burned. The order came down, a piece of unsentimental political calculus. Odysseus perhaps gave it. Others said it was the implacable Agamemnon. The method was debated, then decided. To spill his blood with a blade was wasteful. To leave him to the flames was uncertain. They took him to the highest part of the crumbling wall, near the tower where his mother Andromache had once watched for his father's return. The man who carried him did not look at his face. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, the air thick with falling ash. Below, the city roared like a beast in its death throes. With a single, swift motion, the child was hurled from the parapet. His small form turned in the smoky air, a silent, tumbling shape, before disappearing into the ruin and fire below. The future was dashed on the stones of the past. The name Astyanax died with him, an empty title for a city that would have no tomorrow. The women of the house, the living vessels of memory and lineage, were gathered like precious broken pottery. Hecuba, the queen, her mind already retreating from the horror into a fathomless grief, was allotted to Odysseus. Her eyes, which had seen 50 sons born and most of them die, now saw nothing at all, reflecting only the dancing flames. Andromache, widow of Hector, the model of tragic nobility, was given to Neoptolemus, her son's killer, a cruelty so perfect it felt authored by a malicious god. She moved like an automaton, the light gone from her face, her famous laments trapped inside a throat too choked for sound. Cassandra, the prophetess cursed never to be believed, was dragged from the sanctuary of Athena's temple, where she clung to the wooden cult image. Agamemnon claimed her, seeing in her beauty a prize fit for a high king, blind to the doom her very presence whispered. She went without struggle, a terrible, knowing smile on her lips, for she had foreseen this moment 1,000 times. They were led down to the shore, past the smoldering ruins of their lives, to be loaded onto the Greek ships as living trophies, the last mortal possessions of a kingdom that had ceased to exist. Their fate was not death, but a more protracted extinction, to carry the ashes of Troy within them across the sea, to plant the memory of its towers in foreign soil, where it would grow into nothing but silent, unending grief. The royal house was extinguished, root and branch. The totality of Troy's destruction was now absolute, its history ended, its future negated, its very essence scattered to the winds. The dawn that broke over the Troad revealed a shore transformed. Where the proud walls of Troy had stood, a low, smoldering mound of blackened stone and ash remained, bleeding thin gray smoke into a sky the color of weathered bone. The plain was empty, the Greek camp vanished, the siege lines erased by the final, consuming fire. Only the deep scars of chariot wheels and the pale, scattered bones of the unburied remained to tell of the decade of strife. The Greeks were gone, their 1,000 ships scattered like leaves upon the heaving, gray expanse of the Aegean. But the winds that filled their sails were not the fair winds of homecoming. They were the scattered, vengeful breaths of gods whose altars had been defiled with innocent blood. The great victory was already curdling into a harvest of private doom. For the house of Atreus, the curse woven into its lineage tightened its knot. Agamemnon, high king of the Greeks, sailed for Mycenae bearing the spoils of victory and the Trojan princess Cassandra, whose silent, knowing eyes saw the net awaiting him. He would find not a hero's welcome, but a wife's long-nursed vengeance for a sacrificed daughter. The bath prepared for him would run not with warm water, but with his own blood, a dark echo of the altar at Aulis, as Clytemnestra and her lover enacted their terrible, premeditated justice. His triumphant return would end on the cold floor of his own palace, a king undone by the very domestic order he had fought a war to restore. Odysseus, the architect of the horse, would find the sea-road home transformed into a labyrinth of divine wrath. Poseidon, angered by the blinding of his son, the Cyclops, would hurl storm and shipwreck against him, stretching a voyage of weeks into a weary odyssey of 10 years. He would wander through a world of monsters and enchantments, a phantom king longing for his rocky Ithaca, while in his halls suitors feasted and plotted, believing him lost. His cunning, which had felled a city, would be tested not against armies, but against the seductive pull of oblivion and the slow erosion of hope. His path home a mirror of the war itself, long, circuitous, and bought with endless sorrow. Menelaus, the wronged husband whose grievance had launched the fleet, would wander the eastern Mediterranean for years, blown off course by capricious winds, before finally regaining Sparta with his reclaimed queen, Helen. They would resume their lives in the palace of their former contentment, but the peace would be a fragile shell. The ghost of the war would sit between them at the silent feast, in the unspoken glances, in the memory of the countless dead whose names were the price paid for her return. Their marriage would be a monument to a hollow victory, a shared life built upon the ashes of a world. And for the common soldiers, those who had survived the final slaughter, the journey was no less perilous. Ships foundered in sudden storms sent by angered nymphs. Men died of fever on distant shores, far from the pyres of their comrades. Those who finally beached their vessels on familiar strands often found homes changed, families gone, their places filled by strangers. The glory of Troy was a distant, gilded memory that could not warm a cold hearth or fill an empty belly. The war had taken more than 10 years. It had taken their youth, their certainty, and their place in the world, leaving them ghosts in their own lands. The camera of history pulls back slowly from the charred rubble of Priam's citadel. It drifts over the silent plain where Achilles raged and Hector fell, over the river Scamander that once ran red, past the lonely twin barrows of Achilles and Patroclus on the shore. It settles on the beach itself, now empty but for the whispering surf. The waves, indifferent, continue their eternal work, smoothing the pebbles, erasing the final impressions of the last departing hull. The wind scours the dust, carrying away the last traces of smoke and sound. Troy is gone, not with a bang, but with the soft, relentless hiss of the sea on a deserted shore. The epic has been told. The heroes have passed into song. All that remains is the quiet, the emptiness, and the scattered winds, blowing forever across the silent, enduring stones of memory.